The man with the gray beard covered his eyes and scratched his chin, addressing the little girl in front of him. He called her by her name, Filia, adding that she had something to do. His voice was calm and soft. The girl standing in front of him looked at the man with a perplexed look. He ordered her to find the prince who had escaped to Akansar. The prince was rumored to be preparing a rebellion, so he had to be stopped as soon as possible. Filia stared at the man in surprise. She asked again what exactly she needed to do, hoping that she had misunderstood the man, but he simply remained silent, confirming his words. The girl thought that this task was beyond her, but she could not refuse. A picture popped up in her mind. She saw the scene of the crime. A puddle of scarlet blood on the floor was spreading wide. It seemed that this was not just a figment of her imagination, but was already happening in reality. Then she pictured a man with short tar black hair. His face showed no emotion at all, and there was a bloody mark on his cheek. He was dressed in black robes, and his gaze, staring downward, was fearful. With one hand, the man held a bloody sword, while the other held the body of an already dead man in the air. This was the man whose blood was dripping onto the floor with a loud whoosh. That man in black had just killed someone. The red-haired girl was hiding behind the back of the man who was watching the whole action. In this illusion that flowed smoothly into a memory, Filia saw herself. Her eyes widened and her pupils narrowed. The girl watched this terrible picture. She mentally turned to the high priest with a rhetorical question. How the hell was she supposed to fulfill this man's request? Desperate, the girl began digging through her memories to figure out exactly what had brought her to this dialogue. The girl remembered a morning a few days ago. The sun was just rising above the horizon, and the melodious singing of birds was spilling over the neighborhood. The wind swayed the branches of the trees lightly. The girl slept in her room, covered almost head to toe with a white blanket. The door creaked open and a guest appeared in the room. A thin female voice sounded. The girl was calling for her sister Filia, trying to wake her up. Realizing that Filia was not responding to her attempts to wake her up, she repeated her phrase again a little louder, adding that the sun was already high and she needed to get out of bed quickly. The blonde-haired girl pulled the blanket over her head, covering herself from the sunlight, and asked to sleep a little longer. But the one in charge was undeterred. She clapped her hands, saying that the girl had said similar things before, and she should stop muttering. Trying to delay the moment of her awakening, Filia asked, "Why are humans required to stand on two legs?" Her voice sounded tired and pitiful. The girl, who was dressed as a temple attendant, answered that she didn't have to stand on two legs. She could stand on four. But then she realized that she was being tricked and interrupted her monologue, shouting that the girl had to get out of bed first. She yanked the blanket over herself. Filia screamed as the sunlight hit her eyes. This was roughly how every morning at the convent went. At first light, the girl was awakened by this woman, whom everyone called the main one. Sometimes she would let her sleep for a few minutes, but more often than not, she would go to drastic measures to wake Filia at any cost. She pulled off the blanket and saw the crystal pendant hanging around the girl's neck, shimmering in all colors. It looked mesmerizing in the sunlight. Filia had taken a sitting position and looked like she would sell her soul for a few more hours of sleep. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes looked tired. The thing she disliked most about waking up like this was that as soon as the main one pulled the blanket off Filia, she was terribly cold. Right now, the girl was curled up on the edge of the bed, wailing about how cold she was. But when she heard this, the girl with black hair, who was dressed as a nun, ordered the girl to stop whimpering because the high priest was outside chewing on her. Filia was surprised by this and opened her eyes wide, immediately forgetting about the cold. She rose abruptly from the bed and looked at the main one, questioning if it was true that the high priest had come in person. The girl seemed to glow with joy, while the other girl's face expressed no emotion from the word at all. Filia was pleased and stared at the girl who had just woken her up. Then the one came closer to the girl and leaned in, also looking into her eyes. The girl in black did not break eye contact with the girl and mentally started counting, starting from 1. It was already a familiar action for both of them. When the number 2 sounded in her head, Filia's face changed and she became perplexed. She understood what the nun wanted to do, but she didn't understand why she couldn't just give her more details in her own words. And when the countdown reached 3, a flash of light flickered between the girls. They were still staring intently into each other's eyes, Filia sitting on the bed and the main one leaning over slightly, standing next to the bed. It was the girl's ability, one of the ways she passed on information and memories. It was worth it just to hold eye contact with someone for 3 seconds, and she could, literally, get inside that person's head and dig into their memories. Filia's eyes glowed an otherworldly blue, revealing her magical ability. Her eyes reflected all the information she had seen. She continued to continuously stare at the nun. The dark-haired girl in turn didn't look away either. Her brown eyes reflected those blue eyes of the girl that looked like gems shimmering in the light. Having gotten enough information, Filia was even more perplexed. There was no joy on her face now, her smile darkened. The girl's face was frozen with a look of shock. She couldn't find the words. She could only squeeze out a short, "Eh?" The girl in black moved away from the bed, leaving Filia sitting there alone. She turned her head slightly and asked if the girl thought about standing on her own feet like a human after what she had seen. Mentally, the girl chuckled. She was a young priest's apprentice that she just didn't know what was in store for her yet. The girl had to start dressing quickly. The runoffs of the ballad of the spiked crown, betrayal, and miserable existence swirled in her head. These runoffs were more than just a ballad. The girl believed it was a prophecy. The emperor would die from it. In the distant future, we who look like us will meet again. The last lines of the prophecy kept her in suspense. With a great effort, she gathered herself and overpowered herself to leave the cozy room. Filia went to meet the high priest in the monastery of Rose. In its garden grew red roses with sharp thorns, and the building of the monastery looked grand. Just stepping over the threshold, the girl was immediately confronted with comments about her appearance from the priest. He said that Filia had not changed at all. The girl stood and listened to his pleasantries in silence, thinking how much she wanted to sleep. The man sat on a red armchair attached to the table and waited for the girl to sit down across from him. He acted friendly, waving at her as if she were an old friend or a very young child. Filia felt uncomfortable. The girl made her way to a vacant chair, muttering that the high priest had added a straight-up very many wrinkles. It wasn't an insult, but rather a friendly tease. The man who was sipping tea understood this perfectly well, so he noticed that the girl's habit of talking was still the same. She flopped down in the chair, asking why the high priest had come, and at such an early hour. She wondered why the high priest had come, and at such an early hour. The man looked at her and asked her to guess. It was already clear that he was here on business and not just for fun. Now he only confirmed Filia's fears. The girl looked puzzled, realizing what the priest wanted from her. The man in white leaned closer to her, with a wide smile on his face. He wanted the girl to dig into his thoughts. She was actually getting tired of everyone expecting her to just read their minds. Filia thought it would be much easier if they spoke in words, but still, she stared at the man, activating her ability. The girl's glowing pure blue eyes reflected in the priest's eyes. He stared intently into the two gems, trying to focus on what exactly he wanted to convey to the girl. There was only one nuance to this ability. If the person that was relaying the information wasn't thinking about what they wanted to convey, Filia could get caught up in any of their memories. For example, she could see what that person had for breakfast. On the count of 3, images began to flash before her eyes again. Feeling the fluctuation in energy, even the birds abruptly flew off the branches of the trees, stopping singing. They flapped their wings loudly, trying to catch the wind. The fixed gaze of the man with the white beard seemed a little intimidating, but Filia didn't pay it any mind. Right now, she was trying to concentrate and analyze the pile of information she was being handed. The girl's eyes were filled with light, and her gaze was a little surprised. She was completely engrossed in the process of transmitting thoughts and couldn't think about anything else. She looked more and more surprised with each passing second. After processing all the information she had received, the girl became frightened and pressed herself against the back of the couch. She asked if the high priest was going to kill her. In answer to her question, the man laughed. But she was not satisfied with this and shouted for him to stop and explain himself quickly. Then the man leaned forward again and addressed the girl. It wasn't clear if he was going to mentally convey information or if he was just leaning forward. He said that he actually had a request for Filia. The girl was still startled. She said abruptly and rather quickly that she didn't want to fulfill anything. Filia realized the risk she was taking. She had seen it all in the high priest's mind, and it made her afraid. An awkward silence hung in the room. The man didn't take no for an answer, so he waited stubbornly for Filia to agree to his request, but the girl was unwavering in her decision. The main one, on the other hand, just stood back, watching what was going on. The high priest was the one who interrupted the silence. He questioned again if the girl could handle it. Filia told him with a sneer in her voice that it was no longer a request, but a coercion, to which he thanked her for enlightening him. Then the room fell silent again, and Filia felt increasingly uncomfortable, at the very least because the man had just admitted that he would not be leaving the monastery today without her consent. Realizing that the entreaties could last all day, and remembering her desire for sleep, the girl asked what the man wanted. Filia wanted to hear the order from the high priest in person, not receive it through a spiritual connection. The man sipped some coffee from his cup and said he wanted Filia to pay a visit to the Sappy area. The girl was surprised and cried out loudly. The man added that a rich man seemed to have a problem with his daughter not listening to him. The girl got angry and started protesting, gesticulating vigorously. She said that she wasn't even a real priest and sincerely didn't understand why she was being assigned something like this. The man replied that the girl had been living in the convent for a long time and should be doing something. The man also added that she was the one that Sappy was desperately looking for. Rumors of the girl had traveled all the way from Libanos. Filia looked surprised, then looked away. If she had known this would happen, she wouldn't have taken that case. 3 months ago, she had been summoned to a rather strange family in Libanos. The tyrant of Libanos was a strong leader and an ordinary mother who was worried about her son who was acting like a dog. That's why they called in an exorcist. But then it turned out that the exorcist would be of little help here, as her 12-year-old son was a demon that believed in the halo and unconditional power of his mother. He snarled and hissed at people and really resembled a dog. As soon as the girl remembered this, she mentally began to curse the degree of difficulty of this task. This boy wasn't listening to her at all. The high priest said that afterward, the ruler of Libanos had talked a lot about the girl, calling her the Angel Rose. The girl jumped in surprise, in no way expecting such comments in her direction. She looked embarrassed and surprised at the same time. Her eyes widened. Angel Rose, as if trying to finish, the girl repeated the main. Hearing such an address once again, Filia turned away. Tears seemed to flow from her eyes. The girl asked to stop repeating it because she was dying of shame. After she calmed down a bit, the high priest continued. These rumors, he said, had already reached Sappy, and they had been asked to send a named Angel of Rose. A very rich man had placed the order, and he was having some kind of trouble with his daughter. Filia yelled out that she didn't want to do it. Filia looked a little annoyed. She yelled that taking care of children was not her job, and if someone needed a nurse or a teacher, let them call a professor at home. Really, they're exorcists, and why do aristocrats call them to look after their children anyway? After hearing about the house professor, the high priest immediately said that he failed. That's why they're calling in Angel Rosa. Filia sighed, saying that she only agreed once. Besides, she can't just walk around outside the convent. She asked if the man was worried about rumors about the girl, and he gave her a cold stare and called her name sharply, drawing attention to himself. It was as if he was letting her know that this was not the time for idle chatter. The girl hoped that she had changed the old man's mind, and now she didn't have to go anywhere. She clenched her hands into fists and stared at him, waiting to see what he would say next. The high priest smiled and told Filia that she was going anyway, and she shouldn't waste her energy on empty entreaties. The girl's reaction was instantaneous, and she shrieked across the room, asking God to strike the priest with lightning. So, the young priest's apprentice, without a good night's sleep, embarked on another arduous journey. She walked through the rose garden near the monastery. She was followed by the high priest and the chief priest, fearing that she might run away. Whether from distrust or lack of sleep, dark circles appeared under her eyes. She was shouting that she was tired and didn't want to go anywhere. Her hair was still disheveled, as she had no time to comb it. The girl stopped in front of a huge black carriage. A footman was holding the door for the girl to get up, and the high priest was standing beside her, holding out his hand with a smile and telling her to get into the carriage. Filia turned around sharply and addressed the man with the gray beard. She eyed him warily and asked him what he was up to. The girl looked as if she would not leave until she had an answer to her question. The man asked her what she meant. The high priest looked as if he was up to no mischief and was not at all aware of what the matter was about. What then? What now? Why would this man send Filia specifically? That question kept her in suspense. Then he replied that he was giving her errands nothing out of the blue. It was just that it was already time. He asked if she had anything to contribute to this world. It was a rhetorical question, but the girl still answered that she didn't want to go out into the world. The girl climbed up into the carriage, holding on to the handle on the door, and the man continued to talk. He asked, how many people did Filia think had gone out into the world of their own volition? He himself, after all, had gone out into the world without knowing it. Everything comes with experience. The girl seemed bored with the chatter. She mumbled something. He added that she should drive carefully and come back soon, and that she should not forget what the high priest had told her. The man looked at her with kindness in his gaze. He was dressed in a white robe, and around the man's neck was a cross. Filia looked at him a little disapprovingly. She still didn't like this idea of going to Sappy, but the girl had no choice. She turned to the priest one last time and took one last step into the carriage. She asked that she not be given any more such errands, for all she could do was make eye contact. The high priest assured her that she needed to do the same as she had done in Libanos. The chief stood at the entrance to the temple and waved to the girl. Filia sat in the carriage, the door still not closed. The girl mentally chastised the priest for being easy for him to say when he himself does not. She brought her hand to her breast and clutched the mantle. She turned to the high priest one last time. Filia asked if she could remove the necklace there. That expensive-looking crystal stone that hung around her neck was hidden under the hot robe. That was why she wanted to take it off as soon as possible. The man had said she could only do it if it was necessary, but in a way that no one could see. Those were his last words before the carriage door slammed shut. The carriage moved off. They were traveling on narrow paths, so the vehicle was tossing on every bump. The girl mentally shouted at the high priest, doubting his adequacy. If the man didn't want anyone to see this, there was no reason to send Filia on this kind of mission. The girl looked out the window. The carriage was already pulling up to the mansion of the family that had summoned the angel Rosé. There were many people on the streets, all dressed in different fancy dresses or suits. It was just about rush hour. Angel Rosé stared intently out the window. It was unusual for her to be out in the city. She was surprised at the amount of people on the streets. It wasn't that she didn't like it, but Filia would rather sleep than drag herself into the city this early on a very strange errand. She clasped her hands to her chest with a thought to calm herself down. The sooner she finished this errand, the sooner she could get back, so she couldn't delay. She remembered what the high priest had said. His words that he himself had gone out into the world without knowing it, and that everything comes with experience sounded like thunder in Filia's head. The high priest may have said so, but Filia knew that she should not go out into the world. The girl clutched the pendant that hung around her neck, her gaze becoming menacing and full of anger. Mentally, she convinced herself that she was going to show the high priest that she shouldn't go out into the world. She was going to make him regret it. As soon as the carriage door opened, the girl jumped out of there with a smile on her face. It seemed like there was no one in the world more joyful than her. It was as if all the anger and sadness that had been on her face while she was sitting in the carriage had instantly evaporated. She ran towards the man who was to receive her. The girl said hello, introducing herself as Lily. Even the footman holding the door was shocked at such a drastic change in her mood. In front of her stood a man in a dark blue jacket. He looked very surprised and stared at the girl. Behind him stood the maids. Some of them were glad that she had arrived, and some of them were surprised beyond belief. One of the maids was waving a placard that read, Angel Rosé. Filia continued to smile sweetly. Apparently her strategy was to keep making a fool of herself. She was smiling so wide that her eyes narrowed and her eyelids were almost glued together. But even so, she could see the undisguised surprise. Everyone was surprised that Angel Rosie appeared to be a child. The maids opened their mouths wide, and the man didn't look as welcoming and joyful as he had earlier. Filia cheered as she looked at the disappointed faces of these people. The girl turned away to gloat, at which time the crowd began to whisper. Filia already knew what she would ask for in today's prayer. The girl prayed to the Lord to help her disappoint these people as much as possible today. The Duke turned to the girl, asking if she was sure she had helped the ruler of Libanos. She replied that Lily had really been in Libanos. The man also asked how old the girl was because she looked very young. Filia smiled broadly again and said she was 10 years old. The man and the maids looked very surprised. The information about the age of the glorified angel Rosé was shocking to them. Their faces darkened as no one could be sure that they would be helped by such a little girl. Filia saw this reaction but continued to smile. The girl was afraid that she was overdoing it a lot, but that would only play to her advantage. The sooner she screwed up, the sooner she would be back at the convent. So be it, the girl had no choice. If word of mouth got out about her, things would get a lot more difficult, and Filia didn't want more rumors about her. She looked at the man and remembered how the high priest had introduced him. The man was a very wealthy man, a Chija Don. He had a 17-year-old daughter, Claro. According to the high priest, the lovely daughter suddenly began to act flighty. The man greeted the girl cheerfully and introduced himself as the master of the house. He smiled, trying to make a good impression on her. Filia also kept smiling. Chijadan began to describe the problem. He had approached the convent because his daughter was having problems. The man also added that if the girl could help her in a week, he would pay any amount. Filia looked at the man with childishly wide-open eyes and asked why she should be able to manage in a week. Hearing the tone in which her words sounded, the man completely despaired. He could only hope that this little girl really knew how to do something. He grudgingly replied that the timing was because the wedding was scheduled. Now it was clear that the man was not concerned about his daughter and her reputation, but about his reputation and money. As if to confirm this, he said that he had to send her off on time, so Filia should get her in order as soon as possible. The smile fell off the girl's face. Now she didn't know what to do. If this man wasn't lying or understating things, the girl even wondered for a moment if she should really try to help. But she couldn't believe that she had to meet a deadline simply because of the sacrament of marriage. She was curious, but still, the girl decided to pretend she didn't understand. She smiled again as if nothing had happened, and said that she understood the instructions. Her voice was quite childish. If she had not been accompanied by a carriage from the convent, no one would have believed that she was the angel Rosa. The man led the girl into the mansion. The mansion was grand and looked expensive. It was obvious that this duke was a man with money. But then why did he decide to sell his daughter? Filia had no way of understanding it. Something was not clean here, but the girl did not understand what. She walked down a long corridor, illuminated by the rays of the setting sun. There were red curtains hanging from the large windows and gold moldings on every wall. From inside, the manor looked even more opulent. The girl walked on and insinuated to herself that she shouldn't show interest, but just manage a quickie and leave. Filia thought about the fact that this man must be so fabulously wealthy that he could afford to put an exorcist in a separate building. There wasn't a soul in the entire building the girl was walking through, except for the maids escorting her. The girl pondered this for quite some time, but finally decided that she should not peruse it all, for she was going to make a quick sorting out and leave for the monastery. She remembered the main one telling her this morning that priests were supposed to help those who needed help, and Filia should stop whining and get things sorted out as quickly as possible so she could get back sooner. Taking a few more leisurely steps down the corridor, the girl thought about why she should even take on this kind of task. The chief was right, but the one who made her like this was the high priest, and his oppression and coercion had corrupted Filia. That's what she thought. The girl froze in place, her eyes lighting up with rage, slyness, and gloating. It was as if a dark aura hovered around her. She mentally taunted everyone, thinking that everyone would soon see the atrocities of the apprentice whose blood and tears had dried up. The maid turned around and thought the girl was kind of weird. They walked up to the door of the room. The maid turned around again and said they were to the room in front of them. That was where Clara was now located. Just hearing this, Filia made a strange gesture and shouted open Z-door for all she was worth. The maids were surprised at this prank and thought again that the priestess was acting strangely. The door swung open and light immediately poured in. It was a great contrast to the general lighting in the building. The creak of wooden shutters echoed through the spacious hallway. Filia activated the cute image, about to charm the mistress that would appear before her eyes. She pouted her lips and opened her eyes wider. Apparently, the girl thought that if she appeared cute to Claro, she could quickly take care of the problem. But the sparkle in her eyes evaporated as soon as she saw the one in the room. Filia didn't look so happy anymore. The smile was completely gone from her face. The girl could only sympathize with the girl that sat lonely in her small room. She saw the broken window behind the girl. It became clear why the lighting in this room was so different. It was just that the sun's rays could get here directly. A light breeze was walking around the room, which looked quite unkempt. Filia remembered what the Duke had said about the wedding, and that he had to send the bride on time so the girl should tidy that one up as soon as possible. Remembering all this, his words no longer seemed like empty excuses to her. The girl sat on a chair that was located by a large door with broken glass. The curtains in this room were tattered, shreds of white cloth lying everywhere. Claro seemed to have fallen asleep. She was dressed in a black and white dress that looked like a maid's uniform, and her black tights were gaping holes. Filia couldn't move from her seat looking at this picture. This condition with a deadline of 1 week was impossible to fulfill. The girl looked surprised and a little depressed because she would not be able to return to the convent quickly. Claro opened her eyes and stared at the priestess. There were smudges of mascara under her eyes. Still, her face was smeared in something black. The girl's hair was disheveled and cut short. A desolate case indeed. Filia was already desperate. She was an exorcist, and this girl's problems were clearly not with spirits and demons. She wasn't possessed. Most likely, some psychological factor had affected her like that. Now Filia would have to deal with it. The light of hope in her eyes was finally gone. This was the prophecy. When the crown jewels were scattered, a beast would emerge from the thorns. The beast, tormented by the thorns, would destroy the kingdom and become its last ruler. When the most promising prince of the greatest power, Elion, committed his mortal sin, absolutely everyone in the empire was reminded of this dire prediction. In one day, that became a nightmare for many people. Everyone's favorite prince, Elion, truly went mad. He ruthlessly massacred his brothers, who were potential pretenders to the throne. The murderous prince was branded as a beast and fled into the thorny wasteland. And when the villagers heard of this, many were wary to remember that the prophecy had spoken of a beast torn by thorns. The story of how this ruthless prince, who had suddenly become a fearsome beast, came to be next to a small and harmless student of a priest from a convent a little later. The lovely blue eyes of the sweetest girl, named Filia, widened in a moment of amazement as she stepped inside the chambers of the honored man's daughter, whom she'd been ordered to heal in just a week. The violet eyes of the girl, sprawled in the chair, studied the newly entered guest with interest. The patient's hair was cut short and sticking out in different directions, indicating that she was not quite adequate. Filia was in mild shock, seeing with her own eyes the one she would have to heal in a limited amount of time. The girl's condition did not inspire her with any hope of success in this endeavor. The girl slowly counted to 3, trying to tune in to her highly questionable mission in this case. The girl was sitting in a chair in a rather fretful posture. Her smile on her face was obviously crazy, and her face was decorated with several abrasions. Filia sighed mentally, cursing the high priest for burdening her with such a tedious and thankless job that she had no desire to do. The high priest's apprentice doomedly covered her eyes, gathering her strength to get on with her duties. After all, she was not used to giving up. Filia respectfully greeted the lady sitting in the chair, and the lady addressed her in a friendly manner, calling her priestess. She asked if the girl would like to come closer to her, but Filia was not a fool, and noticing the girl's sly smile, she politely declined the honor. She had been in such situations many times before, so she was very careful. The girl noticed with a nonchalant look that the mistress wanted to pull the little priestess by the hair. At this, a vase flew at Filia, which was thrown with all her might by the distraught patient. Filia was lucky, for the vase hit the wall right next to her, only hitting her with water. The girl stared at the place where the girl had hit with her projectile with frightened eyes. The angry mistress asked if the servant had warned Filia about her abnormality. The little priestess flatly denied it, but the strange girl did not listen and stood her ground. Then the madwoman jumped up from her chair and, clutching its armrests with fury, shouted self-consciously that Filia dared not lie to her. At that moment, she looked quite frightening, with her eyes bulging and her blonde hair sticking out in different directions. The girl, however, remained standing there with her gaze downcast, with drops of cold water dripping down her cheeks, even her reddish hair ruffled by the moisture. The distraught girl collapsed heavily to the floor and gasped as she tried to crawl to the one who had come to supposedly heal her. The chaos in the room only served to push people further away from the mentally ill. Gritting her teeth, the young lady stared at little Filia with a murderous gaze, as if she were seriously trying to burn the girl with her fiercely burning eyes. At that moment, the door opened and a maid appeared in the room. She attracted her distraught mistress by calling loudly to her, and the little priestess exhaled with relief, covering her eyes. The first maid was joined by another, and the two of them tried to pacify the violent patient, who continued to scream and beat hysterically. The girl mentally wondered what the Lord was going to do about it. One of the maids worriedly ran up to Filia, asking the little girl if she was all right, and the young priestess grieved at all that was happening to their mad mistress. Night had fallen on the serene town. Night clouds floated over the high tower of the chapel, and the month blessed the mansion, which right now housed the priest's little pupil, who was doomed to do a not-so-safe job here. Filia stared sadly out the window, reflecting on what had happened. She lamented the fact that her patient had eventually lost her temper, and the conversation hadn't gone well. And then it got worse. As Filia walked to her room, an oppressive atmosphere surrounded her. There were whispers from the maids everywhere, discussing the inappropriateness of the little girl's presence here, and doubting whether she could do anything to help. She was sad, though she had expected this, but if things were left as they were, everyone would say that Filia was a fake angel and send her back in disgrace. Filia remembered the pathetic appearance of the mentally ill girl, and she was seized with a fit of pity and deep regret. She probably hadn't done the best she could in that situation. The girl put her head down on her hands folded in front of her on the windowsill and pondered the fact that maybe she shouldn't have looked into the eyes of the young and unhappy lady. She remembered how she had accepted the sympathetic attention of the maids, pretending to be terribly frightened and crying, forcing them to justify their mistress's abnormal behavior. Instead of feeling sorry for the girl, the maids should have been worried about their sick mistress and tried to understand her suffering. Resting her chin on the windowsill, illuminated by the moonlight, Filia thought to herself this time about what could be done to help the sick girl. Decisively clenching her fist, the young high priest's assistant jumped down from the windowsill. With a loud clatter, she landed successfully with her shoes on the wooden floor of the room. The girl looked up at the sky with a doomed look. A shiver ran through her body and her hand slowly touched her body. Clutching the medallion in her hand, Filia admitted to herself that she had previously treated her duties in this house behind her sleeves because she didn't want to do such a thing. But now, remembering the heartbreaking image of the sick girl, Filia changed her mind drastically, feeling compassion for the patient and her family. With both hands, she grasped the chain of her amulet, removing it from her neck, and solemnly thought that she wasn't going to use it for anything bad and asked for forgiveness. The angry man slammed his fist on the table with all his might, cursing the church along with the newly arrived high priest's apprentice that they had nicknamed the angel Rosé. Long hair of reddish hue scattered over the graceful naked shoulders of the young girl, who suddenly found herself in the place of the little apprentice of the high priest. At this time, the formidable master of the house was giving orders to his close servant to bring the young priestess to him on the morrow, noting that he had not liked the girl from the beginning. In the far room, Filia was coming to her senses. The delicate strands of the beautiful young lady's hair were streaming around her slender neck, and they fluttered into the air, caught by the chain of the locket that had just been removed. Meanwhile, the cruel father ordered his servants not to feed his daughter, to make her have no strength at all. He had also ruthlessly ordered her hands and feet bound so that Claro could not move. Filia clutched the magic locket she had just removed in her hand. Moonlight illuminated the slim and tall figure of the high priest's apprentice, clad in the short, tight robe of a little girl. Clear blue eyes gazed wistfully at the moonlit landscape outside the window. Filia's gaze suddenly locked on an old sprawling tree that towered directly across the street. As a menacing male voice echoed through the huge mansion, insisting that this wedding must take place at all costs, Filia squared her shoulders resolutely, accepting as inevitable that she would have to use all of her abilities to help Claro. The owner of the wealthy mansion grinned his most vile smile with malice and guile in his gaze, happy that his only daughter would soon be married and he would make the most of it. He had promised himself that the marriage would be consummated, but the young apprentice of the high priest had other plans for the precious Claro. The resourceful Filia began to plan her priority actions to bring poor Claro to a normal life, her blue eyes gleaming with excitement and her red strands of hair caressing the porcelain skin of her cheeks. It was unusual for the girl to feel her real body after the long amount of time she had spent as a little girl. She raised and lowered her arms, stepped from foot to foot, and exhaled in relief. Still, it was unusual for Filia to feel like an adult, and it took her a few minutes to fully adjust to the appearance of a mature girl. But the time was not right to think about such inconveniences, so Filia cast a determined glance outside the window, preparing to begin the arduous task at hand. As her small bare feet stepped firmly onto the cold surface of the windowsill, the young high priest apprentice felt the cold air flowing from the window and instantly felt goosebumps. Putting all doubts aside, Filia climbed onto the windowsill and opened the sash of the window, gazing confidently at the moonlit night before her. Before her stood a majestic old tree. It was so large that its sprawling branches peeked through almost every window on the front of the huge house. Using her gift, Filia asked the old tree to share with her the memories of this place, everything it knew about poor Claro's life. And the tree responded, its branches slowly rippling, its leaves rustling mysteriously, sharing with the young apprentice of the high priest the events and secrets known to it. It was hard to understand the thoughts and images conveyed by the tree, but familiar to Filia. Claro appeared to the tree as a young animal that always followed its mother. The girl asked where the patient's mother was, and the tree told her that she was buried in the ground. It became clear to Filia that the girl's mother had died and been buried, but she wondered when Claro had lost her mind. From the tree's explanation, the young priestess realized that the woman had died 6 months ago, and so Claro had begun to behave inadequately quite recently. The girl decided to inquire about the poor woman's mother. Perhaps this was the secret of her illness. The image of a beautiful flower that had been torn off, stripped of its roots, and put in a beautiful vase and left in a dark and lonely place, came from the tree to the young disciple of the high priest. And such a longing smelled from the sad image created by the tree that tears filled Filia's eyes. And the girl realized that the story she was about to tell was a very sad one. Claro's mother was the young and lonely second wife of Sijanen. She was the eldest daughter of a fallen aristocrat that had fallen into debt and had married an old rich man at 19 for the sake of her younger siblings. Sijanen did not treat her as a real wife. The servants despised her and whispered behind her back that she had been sold like a pet. She was much younger than the previous mistress and looked pathetic against her background. Chijanon's young wife was left alone, surrounded by general indifference. But one day she managed to get pregnant, and the girl had a ray of hope that the child would change her life, but things only got worse. From all sides she heard angry whispers that it would be better for her to give birth to a daughter, because if a son is born, the other heirs may not like it very much. It had been a long time since Sijanen had heard of his second wife's pregnancy. He had stopped visiting her altogether. So the young mistress gave birth to the child in loneliness and fear. But hearing the cry of her newborn daughter for the first time, the young mistress felt for the first time an incredible happiness and oneness with another, the most dear human being. The sweet face of the newborn baby, the hand clutching the mother's finger, the sweet infant smell. This was the world in which the young mistress arrived from that time. The blonde-haired girl looked through the objects in the room with wonder and amazement as she lay on the snow-white pillow. Her tears were accumulating in the corners of her eyes, and strands were hanging down from her entire face. She was immediately ready to drift off into her memories with anxiety. The feelings that Filia felt through the images conveyed by the tree were so strong and touchingly beautiful that the girl could not hold back convulsive sobs. Claro's mother loved her as spring rain loves and cherishes flowers, helping them to bloom, and the girl grew up cheerful and happy, pleasing her mother by her very existence. The two were always together until one terrible day they were cruelly separated. Clara was torn from her mother's arms, and no one cared for the suffering of the two unfortunates. The heartrending story told to her by the old tree brought a flood of bitter tears to Filia's eyes. So she huddled on the windowsill, her face pressed into the palms of her hands. Filia wept tears, her mind filled with the pleas of poor Claro's mother calling for her precious child. The young high priest's apprentice gave herself over to the emotions of the mother from whom her child had been taken. After a while, Filia wore the magical amulet again, transforming into a little 10-year-old girl. Her hands gently adjusted the locket on the slender child's neck. She exhaled in relief, sinking to the cold floors of her chambers. The girl's reddish hair was disheveled, sticking out in different directions, and her eyes were still moist after the priestess had cried. It really was quite agonizing for her. Filia had to wipe away the abundance of tears with the sleeve of her robes, causing the skin on the priestess's face to turn red in places. Squirming on the floor, Filia was once again convinced that the ability she carefully hid, even within the confines of the convent, was very dangerous. Reading minds with eye contact, seeing the past, experiencing other people's emotions. Now the girl wasn't crying because she wanted to do it herself. Robbery, so she called her gift, because using it, Filia steals someone else's experience, history, thoughts. This terrible talent intensifies with age and is so far controlled by the sealing necklace. The girl is actually 18 years old, yet she is forced to hide in the body of a 10-year-old child. It was a curse that nevertheless protects young Filia. Fumbling in the darkness, the girl finally managed to find a hair ribbon to clean herself up after the nightmarish journey into the depths of Claro's and her mother's past. Rising to her feet, Filia determinedly pointed out to herself that using her gifted ability to read a tree's mind was against the rules and not a good thing. And then Filia's mind caught on another block of information. Something had happened in the small villa opposite the main building of the estate. It turned out that Claro's mother had died in it, died in agony and loneliness. It became a little clearer what had happened to Claro. She'd been treated coldly all her life by everyone but her mother. And after her painful death, the young girl, deprived of the only support, plunged into the hell of uncontrolled aggression. Now the young assistant of the high priest understood everything completely. However, the session of mental communication with the old tree and the tragic story that had passed through her had exhausted Filia. In the meantime, the silent summer night had come to its full force. The stars were strewn across the sky, and the silver moon, which was growing every night, stood out brightly in the midst of them. Meanwhile, in her bed, illuminated by the moonlight, slept poor Claro, who had been soothed into temporary oblivion. Her dreams this night had been peaceful. And then the silhouette of a little girl appeared against the doorway of her bedroom. It was the young apprentice of the high priest who had come to see the unfortunate daughter of the mother who had died in agony. Taking advantage of the fact that the girl seemed calm and quite normal during the night, Filia decided to try to establish contact with her patient. Claro woke up and looked at the girl fearfully, trying to recognize her. The girl noticed that Claro seemed more adequate at night. Claro finally recognized the young clergywoman, and Filia looked intently at the girl and said that there was no need to pretend in front of her, and even if she would tear the hair on her head and freak out, the engagement would not be canceled. The girl was surprised at this turn of events. She froze, sitting up in bed and staring at the visitor who had appeared in the middle of the night. And Filia persistently inquired whether Claro really wanted to break off the engagement. And seeing the agreement in Claro's eyes, the young high priest's apprentice repeated that she should stop acting crazy in her vain attempt to avoid the engagement. Filia sat on the windowsill, continuing to ask the tree questions about the reason for such behavior in Claro, to which the tree said that, although it does not know much, but the girl is definitely healthy, and the tree is sure of it. Completely racked with regret towards Claro and her mother, Lily cries, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand, but still continues to talk to the tree, deciding to ask if it's because Claro is just afraid of being treated the same way as her mother. Back to what's going on in Claro's own chambers, so Lilia claims that she never went crazy, but simply acted crazy, looking very serious even as a 10-year-old. Filia says that even if Claro manages to thwart this marriage, her father will quickly find replacements, because she is the daughter of a rich man, and will not take as a wife even completely crazy. But the girl only gets angry, asking what the girl can even know. Thinking that she knows everything about Claro already from the moment she was born, Lily involuntarily thinks about the fact that Claro and her mother are very much like two flowers, two roses in a vase, as the tree said. Thinking that she does have an insanely strange ability, but continuing to remain visually calm, Filia tells her that, in fact, Claro's mother left her something because she was worried to death about her daughter. At first, Claro is furious and annoyed, accusing the priestess of lying, for she might have known, even jumping up from the bed, ready to hit her, but still hesitating as the girl's phrase refutes her in shock. Remembering her mother, Claro abruptly calmed down and opened her eyes in mute wonder, remembering her beautiful image and the time when she was dying, for she herself had also worried greatly about her mother until her death. Claro recalls how she begged her father on her knees to call a doctor for her mother, but her father argued that she didn't need a doctor, because the servants would take care of her, and that he would take care of everything himself, and that his daughter should go to school. Not finding help in her father, Claro turned to one of her older brothers to influence her father or the servants through him, but the latter dismissed the younger one, saying that her father had just thrown her mother away, because if rumors spread that her mother was ill, it would be difficult to marry her off. Claro also remembered the moment when the servants took her mother from her chambers, taking her under their arms and taking her somewhere, while she screamed and tried to find out something, but they answered only that it was their master's order because the lady might be sick with tuberculosis and she needed isolation. Returning to the association with flowers, Filia imagines how one beautiful rose in a vase wilted in this way, in the form of Claro's mother, for after her migration she died almost immediately. 3 months later, Claro's father called her to announce that he had found her a good husband, that it was her time to fulfill her destiny and her duty to fate, that the girl did not even need the details of a groom, for it was the daughter's duty to obey her father. Claro, holding mourning for her mother's death and therefore all in black, looks at her father with haggard and shocked eyes, trying to understand what wedding he can talk about when less than 6 months have passed since his wife. Claro, sitting in front of the mirror, thinks about how she could have replied that if it is the daughter's duty to obey her father, then isn't it the husband's duty to call a sick wife a doctor, but she didn't have the heart to answer like that. Claro thinks both of herself and of her late mother, knowing that there is no one in this house who would listen to her, love, and respect her, and she does not even realize whether this one is truly herself. With trembling and sweaty hands, Claro reaches for the scissors, still wondering if she should dare to take such a desperate step, but apparently there is no more way out. She brings the blades to her beautiful, long, soft pink hair, looking in the mirror with a slightly distraught look, and her hands are still trembling because it is scary to dare. Thus the last rose in the vase was also slaughtered, leaving the room without anything living at all, leaving 2 roses in a beautiful place, not cared for, but waiting to smell and look beautiful. Claro is still in disbelief, leaning forward just to avoid looking at the priestess, and wonders if it was just the maids telling her all this, for the or might have thought that this was how Lily could convince her. Striking Claro more and more, Filia utters her mother's last words to Claro, which she said just before she died, filled with love and concern for the daughter she had left behind. Filia seems completely indifferent to the whole situation, but her voice is very expressive, so that she even recreates in Claro's mind an image of her mother that she had already forgotten. Claro tries to find out how she knows these words, but she only replies that she didn't want to interfere, but she felt too sorry for Claro's mother and because of that for herself, so she will help her. Under the light of the moon and an open window, Lily assures the girl that her mother really wanted and solidarity to make her happy, doing everything in her power to do so, and even before her death thinking of her beloved and only daughter. Claro finds it hard to believe what the girl in front of her said. She still stares in utter amazement, not understanding how it all turned out like this and how the priestess even knew about it, since not even Claro herself knew. And the letter wasn't stolen by the servants who always despised her mother. Sitting up in bed and unable to get away from the shock that had struck her, Claro thought of her mother, who had never been happy, and she was sure that she would be the same in marriage, and she could not afford to be happy, because her mother had died because of her. Filia, thinking about how much she felt sorry for the girl and her mother, even with the fact that she didn't care before, would turn out, but she tried to convince Claro that her mother hadn't always lived in complete misery. Filia took confident steps, clomping her little black heels and shuffling her ecclesiastical robe as she walked closer to the bed and to the girl herself, ready to loudly announce something to her. Taking the letter she spoke of from her pocket, Lily gives it to the girl, who, still not fully believing it, looks at the envelope in utter surprise, but nevertheless with a spark of hope in her gaze, which was all ready. It was very gratifying. Claro, seeming to trust the priestess completely, reaches for the concert with the letter, feeling her eyes quickly hinting at the tears that are about to flow from her eyes, but for now she tries to hold on. But as soon as the girl took the letter in her hands, she immediately burst into tears, unable to keep her emotions in herself any longer. And Lily, deciding that now Claro needed to be alone, hurried away from her the same way she had come, that is, through the window. The sun over the estate was bright and pleasant, and the sky was almost completely clear, with only occasional soft feathery clouds, which she wanted to touch and use as a pillow. Filia stood outside the entrance to the manor while compliments came from all directions, as all the servants claimed she was an incredible sorceress, a true angel of rose, and similar flattering expressions. Filia did not seem to like the compliments at all, for it was all said by those people, not only the servants, who yesterday had insulted her and put her down for nothing, allowing themselves to discuss her behind her back and put her down for nothing. But here, their estate flies out already so native face in the video of Claro, who runs in a light white dress and clearly behaves many times better than yesterday, and is now looking for her unattractive savior. Claro looks much better even physically, for now there are far fewer bags under her eyes, and a soft, sincere, and joyful smile, for the new day finally shines on her face rather than a frantic one. Turning around at the familiar voice, Filia looked obviously much more pleased than when she had been praised by the estate staff, for at least Claro was her peculiar test subject and someone whom Lily herself had to help. The maids behind her and Filia's backs exclaimed, even overjoyed, that their mistress was finally back to normal, and the priestesses were reminded that their mistress had never been out of the norm. The two uniformed maids behind Filia were saying that the rumors about the priestess working miracles were true, while Filia herself was getting darker and darker, saying that it wasn't like that at all. Suddenly one of the maids says that she saw Filia come to the lady's house last night, and at such words Lily turns sharply, with a face full of confusion, for she fears that someone saw her enter the villa where Claro's mother died. Mr. Chijanen, with a bunch of servants behind him, with a face full of happiness, was ready to embrace and kiss the young priestess who had saved his marriage contract and pulled his daughter out of madness. Filia was clearly not very pleased with such attention because she was well aware that thanks to such success rumors about her will spread very quickly, and to live a quiet life is unlikely to be able to. Sijanon decided to organize a feast for the priestess alone, ordering to set the table with several kinds of meat, salads, vegetables, soups, rolls, and many other things, trying to find out how he could thank Lily. Sianon, who seemed to be happy even too much, decided to keep Filia company at the meal, keeping up with her questions about gratitude and how he had been pleased with her from the beginning. Lily, even though she tried to appear kind, happy, and actually happy that she had been able to help, because she had to keep playing out her act about a naive 10-year-old girl, it didn't feel right in her heart. Lily was surprised at the sudden change in attitude towards her, not only from Mr. Chijanan, but in general from everyone, because the man himself almost sang in her honor, but she herself was afraid to become a priest officially. Despite all the joy of the maids, butlers, and the master himself, Filia was sick, because they behaved so calmly, as if in the state of Claro and in the death of her mother were absolutely not to blame, and came to understand that this house is simply abnormal. Already frowning a little, Lily thought, continuing to eat her soup under the attentive gaze of Sijanen, who was still waiting for the priestess to tell her how he could thank her for such a favor. And Filia decided to really think about it, since the elder had spoken before, it wouldn't be impertinent, and she had really done everything that was asked of her, so a reward was something logical. But Filia refuses the reward, saying that a simple thank you from Sijanen himself would be more than enough, though in truth she just didn't want anything, foreseeing how turbulent the near future would be. Also, Filia thought that the entire reward would go to pay for her tuition, which was already understandable given how long she'd been living in the monastery, but to Shianona, she tells him that she was just doing whatever she had to do without expecting a reward. Chijanen was apparently touched by these words, and Filia's sweet childlike face, so he had no thoughts that the girl might be lying to him or not telling him something, nor did he care about the way she had saved his daughter. Continuing to make a baby face, Filia says that she just wants to get back to the convent as soon as possible, thinking that she's just terribly tired and wants to get away from people, so she'd like to get home as soon as possible, but Sijanon agrees as it is, saying that he'll get the carriage ready. Pleased that they won't have to spend any money, Sijanon shifts his attention from the priestess to the butler, rushing to order him to start preparing the carriage for their guest, who is already in a hurry to leave them and return to her convent. Filia notices that Sijanon is directly glowing, although yesterday he looked like a rotten potato, but it will still be so that the unknown daughter of a rich man, Clara, will be given in marriage, but she will do well. Filia, already about to leave, listens to Claro thanking her, who really now sees the light in her life and is ready to thank the priestess for it for the rest of her life, because thanks to Lily, she is no longer afraid. Claro decides to ask the priest what awaits her in her future marriage, because she has seen her past and learned many details about the life and death of her mother. But Lily replies that she does not know because she cannot see the future. The priestess just shrugs her shoulders and looks away, knowing that there is nothing she can do to help the girl, and she can only hope that poor Clara will be fine. Filia gives advice that now it will be necessary to just live, making maximum efforts, and such a phrase even amazes Claro, who has never heard such a thing before. But the phrase itself, Claro liked it very much, and she realized that this advice will be used, apparently, for the rest of her life, and Lily was only sincerely happy for her, because from her eyes, apathy disappeared, and the girl began to shine. Filia thinks that the current situation is radically different from her plan, which she made when she first came to the estate, but now she has no regrets. All the maids and servants of the manor say goodbye to the angel Rosé with sincere happiness, wishing the priestess a good journey, wishing her health and happiness, as well as being happy to have personally met the saint. Claro, hearing all these wishes, still shines, but Filia is not happy about them because with such an attitude, she does not know what to expect from her future, really worrying about it, because she will now be expected everywhere. When Filia was about to get into the carriage, she was suddenly called by Claro, who apparently still had something to say to the priestess, whom she now simply adored. Claro bends down to be on the same level with the priestess and to whisper to Filia what was left on her soul with peace of mind, and without further ears. To the surprised looks of her father and servants at such a hard look, Claro begins quietly, assuming that Filia will still be able to meet her mother with the help of her spiritual powers. Claro asks Filia to tell her mother not to worry about her, for now she will live happily ever after, while Lily regrets that she appeared to the girl like this, for now she thinks that the priestess is really a real angel. Such a request still struck Filia, although, rather, she was struck by such confidence of the girl for her future, faith in her future happiness, and such a wonderful peace, which the priestess has never met anywhere else. But Claro blushes, thinking that her mother will really be glad to hear these words, will finally let her daughter go and can rest in peace, because even in death she cared only for her precious daughter, but now she can be calm. Filia smiles, thinking that she's very glad that this letter helped Claro, mentally still sending a kind of signal to Claro's mother, saying that now her daughter will be fine, although she herself even feels a kind of envy. Filia assures Claro that her mother has already heard everything, and now the girl is completely free in this mansion which tried to chain her mother first, and now has also chained her, but she was able to get out and stand on her feet. Some echoes in her memory as Filia looked up into the sky recalled some strange poem, as if someone had met someone in the future again, leading to someone else's death. Lily, in complete confusion, completely shifts the center of her attention to the sky, because of which everything started, because everything seemed very strange and sudden, and she never had such a thing without eye contact with the amulet around her neck. Even already sitting in the carriage and waving to the Chijanans and their servants, Filia was still trying to figure out what strange feeling had come over her when she had just looked up at the sky while talking to Claro, for even with her fever, this was the first time something like this had happened to her. She decided to lie down in the carriage and try to sleep, thinking that way she could distract herself from the thoughts that kept entailing and the desire to find out what that feeling was. And even though she was really interested, Filia wasn't burning to find out what it was. But she couldn't sleep, for she just looked up while there were so many different questions in her head about what it was. There were even some speculations about what it could have been, but there were few real ideas and no answers at all. Looking up at the sky from the carriage window, she thinks that this feeling from the moment she looked up at the sky back then never called her to let go, wrapping her in its embrace and sincere incomprehension of what was happening. Already stepping out of the carriage, there is still a sense of that feeling, like a notion of some prophecy that even says that there is no need to cry, for a strong sin is not forever anyway. She turns back again, trying to understand what it is, deepening further, because the feeling said that she would be the beginning of this era and its end, and she herself would connect all these events. The sky seems to transport her to a man with long dark hair, holding a child in his arms, looking up into the sky, perhaps even hearing and seeing this vision, feeling these sensations. Filia wants to move on, but lingers her gaze on that ill-fated sky, which may prophesize that by this story she too will come to, though it all sounds like the most incoherent text possible and some sheer ravings of a madman. The horses are snorting and stomping on the place, happy that they have already arrived at the place, and there is no need to go anywhere else, and that they can rest under the rays of the scorching sun, even through the leaves of the trees. And the sun shines very brightly indeed, making the leaves of the trees glow so that there is no way to escape from the bright light, leaving a not too perfect tan on the skin. The carriage had already emptied. Filia was met by a servant who was trying to guide her out of the trance she had fallen into, looking up at the sky again and thinking deeply about all the feelings that were haunting her. It was not possible to pull the priestess out of her thoughts at first, but nevertheless the servant tried hard, for she should have returned to the convent she had longed for when she was still with the Sidjanons. Still, Filia responds to her name for some time, looks up at the butler, and looks at him in a perplexed way, not understanding what he wants from her, and he in turn asks if she is all right, for Lily has been hanging about for some time without answering. Filia looks the butler over from head to toe while he also waits for her answer, hoping that now she wouldn't have to wait as long as she had before, but the priestess remained silent, just staring at the man, not even thinking to answer, really. She continued to remain silent even when she looked up and began to look the butler straight in the face, embarrassing him as, for some reason, she was still silent, though perhaps just thinking of an answer. Filia decides that an answer is necessary. She says that she just wants to eat, and the butler replies that if she's really well, he should leave, because she will be safely fed at the monastery. The butler stays by the carriage, and Filia, going backwards and forwards, waves to him as a sign of farewell, thinking that the feeling of hunger appeared to her quite suddenly, and there is no reason to wave to the butler. Filia stood with her hand raised and went back into herself, thinking again, for the feelings that had come over her when she had looked up at the sky were not going to let her go, troubling her mind and thoughts and preventing her from concentrating on what was really important now, getting home. She looked up and lowered her hand, starting to look around at the forest that was so familiar and already home, as if she had missed it for all the time she'd been away from it, though in truth she just wanted to get back to bed as soon as possible. And somewhere far away, above some castle, the sun did not shine at all. On the contrary, the tops of the towers went up into formidable dark clouds, because of which neither the sun nor the sky could be seen, and it seemed as if they had never been in the sky. The dark-haired, curly-haired man bows to someone who orders him to summon a priest to Akansara, which clearly confuses the curly-haired man, and he's not happy about the decision either. He straightens up and stares after the one who gave him the order, calling this person His Highness, which means that this person is a real prince, dressed in not too elegant clothes, but in a wolf hair cloak. Curly keeps looking after the prince that he doesn't even think of looking back, walking exactly confidently and realizing all his goals and intentions, since he has arranged such a majestic and scary castle, as if from fairy tales. Filia reached the monastery by noon, when the sun was high above the horizon. The wind swayed the branches of the mighty trees lightly, and the chapel of the monastery was bathed in sunlight. It all turned out to be a sham in the end, because her father was going to marry Claro off against her will. The girl thought about it all the way and could not stop thinking about it even when she reached the convent. She told this heartbreaking story to the main one, but she just stood there and listened attentively. Filia also added that the girl's mother had had a hard time after the wedding. It seemed to her that she had been able to figure it out so quickly only because she had found a letter from Claro's mother that had been thrown away by the servants and had given it to the girl. Filia immediately remembered wandering around the long-abandoned outhouse at night looking for that scrap of paper. After reading the letter from her mother, the girl felt much better. Filia stood in front of the person in charge and told her about her worries. The girl didn't know if she had done the right thing. Maybe she shouldn't have prying into other people's memories and digging through old archives for the sake of this letter. Maybe everyone would have been better off if it had remained a secret. After all, even if Clara was relieved, she was still being forced into a forced marriage. No matter how much this girl smiled, no matter how much she believed in life, could a young lady be happy without following in her mother's footsteps? What if she repeats this tragic fate? Filia was worried. Right now, the girl priestess had nothing to regret, but deep down she was afraid that her interference would make Claro's life a living hell. Filia clutched the pendant that was hidden under her robe. The chief stood silent for a few more moments, pondering everything the girl had said. The woman in the black nun's robe didn't know what she should say. She could see how much Filia had been affected by all of this, and she didn't want to stay away. She turned to the girl and took her by the shoulders. There was tenderness and warmth in the gesture. The girl said that it was the duty of the monastery's servants to comfort. Everything else is their own life and their own responsibility. She spoke clearly and without sympathy. The woman praised the girl, saying that she had done an excellent job. The priests just needed to do their best and not go beyond the unimaginable. The main one looked at Filia with a calm gaze. Her words and edification were sincere. Hearing such a motivational speech, Angel Rose raised her head and her eyes shone again. The girl no longer looked depressed. How little she needed after all. As soon as she heard the warm words from the main one, her life was back to normal. The girl smiled and said she understood the main, and that was the end of her official visit. The girl in the black robe said again that Filia had done a good job. Now the task could be considered completed. Everyone was happy, and the girl hoped she could finally get some sleep. But then she remembered something else. Filia had called out to the main one, referring to the one in charge as her mentor. The girl said that she seemed to have another problem. The woman didn't hesitate to ask what else was troubling the girl. Filia's face darkened again. Tears seemed about to flow from her eyes. She rubbed her eyes with her hands and said in a shaky voice that she thought she was seeing illusions. The woman asked if she had heard correctly and what kind of illusions she was talking about. The girl jabbed her finger behind the main one's back, looking completely lost. She narrowed her eyes and turned around, trying to see what Filia was pointing at. She wondered what illusions they were talking about and if they were really illusions. Filia smiled slyly, and her eyes glittered with a sinister fire. She said that she could see the high priest sitting behind her back. The girl did not understand what the hell it was. Was she so tired that she was seeing such strange things? It seemed to her that the high priest was right there, leisurely sipping tea from his favorite white cup, not caring about anything. The chief seemed to notice something too and became wary. The man raised his hand in greeting and called out to the girl, telling her that she had done a good job. He looked a little shocked, his pupils narrowed, and Filia, for her part, was not unreasonably frightened. The girl asked loudly, since when could illusions talk, thinking that it was because of the high priest that she had that strange premonition. The man continued speaking, tilting his head back slightly. He said he had been waiting for her report and was very impressed with the work she had done. His blue eyes rested on the girl. She still didn't know if he suspected something wrong in this case, or if he, like the others, blindly believed in the unconditional abilities of the Angel Rose. The girl looked shocked and frightened. She would like to think that this man with the gray as ash beard was really just a figment of her imagination, but unfortunately it was indeed the high priest. This realization made Filia cringe. She looked into his eyes and counted to 3 in her head. After standing like that for a moment and thinking, the girl mockingly asked if he was mocking her, adding that he knew full well that with her ability, Filia could quickly find out what was on his mind. But then, the priest also decided to reveal his memories and thoughts to her. A strange space of exchange was formed between the two people. There were scraps of memories and strange symbols floating everywhere, which from time to time were formed into words. Filia was surprised, and the man still held his cup in his hands and smirked. The girl opened her eyes wide, trying to figure out what was even going on. She looked at the high priest, reading his thoughts, but she didn't understand why everything was going on like this. There must be some mistake, the girl thought, not averting her gaze. The high priest was also staring at her. His gaze now was not as joyful and careless as before, but cold and focused. It was as if the information being conveyed really did have some importance and was shocking. Breaking eye contact, the girl was silent for a few seconds. None of the people present were the first to start a dialogue. But then, curiosity took over, and Filia said that she had already traveled to Sappy at the high priest's request. The man looked at her, as if to ask her to get to the point. He quickly called the girl a good boy and waited. The girl repeated again. She said she had already traveled to Sappy and completed all her errands, so why then did this man still want her dead? She looked more serious than usual. The high priest laughed and started to deny it, saying that he had never even thought about it. Filia added that she'd already had that feeling before Kona was in Sappy. She said she thought the man just wanted to use her as free labor. The high priest squirmed in his chair and said that he actually had a request. He then corrected his words, saying that, in truth, that request was the real deal. He had sent the girl to Libanos and Sappy just to test her strength and see if she was fit for the job. Filia had freaked out and screamed, and this, in his mind, was a test, and she thought something was wrong. First, the high priest sent her to Libanos and then to Sappy. The girl scratched her head and wondered what he was up to, addressing the high priest as if he were her grandfather. Doesn't this grandfather worry at all about what might happen? Wouldn't he have a problem if someone found out that Filia was hiding here? After all, for the past 8 years, she's been hiding her age with a necklace, pretending to be dead and living in the Rose Convent, and now what? The man said that in a way the girl is right, but the situation in the world has already changed. He also added that Filia had something to do. The girl didn't like the idea anymore and would have liked to give up at the start, but as in previous times, she didn't have much choice. The high priest scratched his beard and said that Filia must find the prince who had escaped to Akansar, as he was preparing a rebellion. The man said it as calmly as if it were a trivial matter. The girl, on the other hand, looked shocked. Her eyes widened. She couldn't believe her ears. The high priest was clearly overestimating her, or he was deliberately sending her to her death. Either way, how did he think she was supposed to prevent rebellion in this little girl's body? After all that was said, the high priest opened his eyes. His gaze was like that of a madman whose plan seems to have failed from the start. He added that the girl must stop him at all costs. The man's voice chattered husky and commanding. It was nothing short of an order. Filia was still in shock. She didn't know what to say, or if she should answer at all. The high priest didn't take no for an errand, so she only had to agree to it. Filia didn't fully understand why she should be the one to search for this prince, sending herself to certain death. The lines of the prophecy rang in her head again. It spoke of ruling, jewels of no weight and doom. When the crown jewels were scattered, a wounded beast would emerge from the thorns. The beast, tormented by the thorns, will destroy the kingdom and become its last prince. Immediately afterward, the high priest also mentioned the prophecy. He did not take his eyes off his cup, which was once again filled with tea. He asked if Filia knew about the prophecy and if she had heard it before. The girl said that at the coronation of the first king of Elion, this prophecy had been voiced by the prophet Gelogia. Her voice sounded resolute and confident. The high priest looked at her again with a smile, and it was as if that mad expression on his face had never been there. The man with the gray beard replied that the girl was right. It was the curse of Elion that everyone knew about. This prophecy was not so secret or rare. Everyone in the priest world really did know about it. The high priest shifted his gaze from his cup to the girl again and asked, "Does she know in that case that the prince is now in Akansar?" The man stared intently into her eyes to see if she was lying. Filia felt as if she was a defendant under interrogation. The prince's whereabouts were also known to one and all. For the last 6 months, the whole country had been buzzing with news about this man. The girl lowered her gaze, thinking things over carefully. The third prince, Ero Elion, killed his brothers and fled to the wastelands. Ankasar is a wasteland covered in thorns. It is a closed, abandoned, and fully permitted place. Now it was up to the girl to keep the road there. There the prince took his seat and began to gather his companions around him. It is said that it is never bright in the wastelands. No sunlight penetrates there, and everything is forever mired in pitch blackness. No one in their right mind would go there to seek a better fate. Fugitives, debtors, and criminals united and elected him ruler. The high priest said that the prophecy said that the escaped prince was trying to destroy the country. The girl interjected. She didn't think the prophecy said that as well. The high priest nodded and began to quote a passage from an ancient manuscript that was compiled long before the prince was born. It wasn't enough for the prince who became the Shadow King to take out his brothers. He would threaten his father. All men were certain that the beast from the prophecy, tormented by thorns, was Ero Elion. The man reiterated that the young man intended to kill his brothers, destroy the country, and become the only prince. He would truly be the last prince. Filia looked at the high priest with wonder in her eyes. There was still no way she could accept that she was being sent on this mission. She laughed. The girl's laughter sounded a bit hysterical, and her eyes narrowed. If this man had already killed several dozen people, what could she, albeit a powerful priestess trapped in a little girl's body, do to him? Threaten him with her gem? Filia caught hold of the hem of the chief priest's skirt and cried out, turning to the Lord. Did the high priest really want to kill her, sending her to her death in such a dangerous place? The girl did not want to believe it, but all the facts spoke for themselves. Filia shouted that she was just a child and she may not have aspirations to live as long as the high priest, but she certainly wasn't going to die now. The girl looked angry and menacing, and her voice trailed off as if she was mentally cursing the high priest with every curse she knew. The man looked away and laughed, recognizing the girl's familiar manner of speech. She continued her monologue, saying that she would rather play dolls with the devil. The young man had gone crazy. He had killed his brothers. Filia did not understand what she should say to such a man. The high priest answered all her questions briefly enough. The man scratched his beard and said that there were no beasts that went feral for no reason. Didn't Filia know that? He asked. His words sounded like a rebuke. The girl waved her hands, answering that even if there was a reason, it was still dangerous. But the high priest had a way out of it too. He agreed that the errand was extremely dangerous, but he said that was why he was entrusting it to Filia. She can read people's souls like an open book. The girl angrily stomped her foot, assuring the man that she wasn't as good as he thought she was. The high priest said that it was not the time to talk about who was good at what, for the prince was already gathering people, and it would not be long before chaos broke out. He pressed that, nevertheless, it was your majesty's job. The man stood up from his comfortable chair and walked towards the girl. Such an abrupt change in his mood and behavior made Filia feel uneasy. Puzzled, she asked why the man was coming closer. But she got no answer, and he kept advancing. He crouched down on one knee in front of the girl, so that their eyes were at the same level. The man wondered loudly if this meant that Filia wouldn't care at all when Akansar was covered in blood. The girl looked even more puzzled. There was no way she wanted to get into a discussion like this, having not gotten much sleep and having just come from a mission. She didn't care about Akansar, but Filia realized that this was just manipulation on the part of the high priest, and nothing more. Though the man realized that the girl had figured out his trick, he continued to stare intently into her eyes, waiting for an answer. His gaze was slightly intimidating and full of determination. The man's eyebrows were drawn menacingly to the bridge of his nose, emphasizing his inner coldness. Seeing this expression on the high priest's face, Filia was startled and clutched her skirt tighter. Her eyes glazing over, there was no face of fear on the girl. Her smile finally darkened. Filia herself didn't realize why she was reacting this way. And then the girl abruptly released the black cloth from her hand. It meant only one thing. She was going to do something and go somewhere fast. But where? The man cowered at her, noticing that the hem of her skirt was no longer being clutched or pulled to the side. In a way, she was glad for that, but in another way, the girl also realized that Filia's aggression was already at its limit. The girl pressed her lips together, contemplating what to say to her. She looked at the main one, then at the man sitting on one knee in front of her, and didn't dare to say anything. But after thinking a little longer, she still shouted sharply that the high priest was destined to go straight to hell. Only having said that, the girl turned and ran out of the room, leaving the high priest and the main one alone. The man pulled a smile back onto his face. He seemed to enjoy the spectacle. Still, it wasn't often he could afford to be entertained like this. The man had had a lot of work to do lately because of that wily and belligerent prince, and now, Having turned the most important task over to Filia, he was happy. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon. The girl locked herself in her room and refused to come out. She had a grudge against the one who wouldn't let her just stay out and not get involved in this whole Akansar and the prince whose crown was in spikes. A careful feminine hand made 3 rhythmic knuckle taps on her door. A quiet MGM was heard outside the door of the room. Unfortunately, the girl couldn't get over herself and respond normally, as she was still offended. The maid knocked again and then called the girl by name. Filia, on the other hand, was sitting in the corner of the room, wrapped in her priestess robe and apparently going to sleep. The chief asked her to open the door to pass the food. As the girl must have been hungry, due to her tense conversation with the high priest, she hadn't eaten at all. The chief brought a fresh sandwich and a cup of tea with the words, "You must be hungry." Filia opened the door. She looked gloomy, but she was very hungry. The maid mentally chuckled at how quickly the girl had agreed to her terms for food. Angel Rose stepped closer to the girl with the plate and said that blackmailing a 10-year-old was outrageous. Drool was dripping from the corners of her mouth. She was starving to the point of starvation. The girl in the black robe said that the girl was drooling. Filia then led her inside so she could set down her plate. The girl's room was quite small. There was a desk in the corner of the room and a rack of books next to it. The sandwich the girl in black had brought tasted divine. A leaf of lettuce, grated cheese and tomato, all on a thin slice of white bread. The girl immediately pounced on the food. As the girl chewed, she complained about the high priest. In her eyes, he was like a serpent, doing despicable things to her. Even now, first he burdened her with work, now he was sending her to her death. Filia was in a bad mood because of that grandfather. The little priestess was eating a sandwich with big bites, and the main one looked at her, squinting. The girl's eyes were full of tenderness and light. She seemed to be supporting Filia. Filia said that Libanos and Sappy were just a test to send the girl to the prince. This high priest had thought of everything and planned it all out. The chief sat on the bed next to the girl and quietly agreed. The girl was also just now recognizing that man's plan. She added that if she had found out earlier, Filia would have been able to see everything in her eyes. The girl realized that the high priest had been so skillful at hiding it all that he had not told even his closest subordinate. Filia loudly declared that she would return to Sappy and make a mess of things there. On hearing of such plans, the chief warned her that it was better for the girl not to say it aloud, but only to think about it. Then Filia repeated the same phrase in a whisper, but not a task here either. The maid interrupted her again and told her that even whispering was not allowed. The maid sat on the bed next to Filia and looked away. Her gaze was downcast, apparently caught on something on the floor. The girl's pitch-black hair was gathered into a neat coiffure so that not a single lock stuck out or dislodged. Filia was also sitting on the bed, eating her sandwiches greedily. A smile was back on her face as she ate the delicious food and chatted sweetly with the main girl. There was an awkward silence between the girls. Only the head girl thought it was awkward because Filia was too busy eating to assess the situation. The main one was preparing to say something and carefully considered every word. She addressed Filia, adding the prefix mistress. The girl said that priests should help those who need help. Filia replied that she understood that perfectly well. It was already night outside the window, the moon shining white and the silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. Filia immediately began to deny that this was a very serious matter and the girl couldn't handle it alone. Her face became sad. Her eyes seemed about to fill with bitter tears of despair. The maid added for the girl to do her best and not worry about anything else. It was a slight hint that although the girl did not support the high priest's methods, she too thought Filia was the best person for the position. The girl looked up sharply, breaking away from her food. On the tray she was holding in her lap was a plate with an overbitten sandwich on it. The girl yelled almost hysterically that she didn't want to take on such a responsibility, looking at the main one. Filia began to justify herself, saying that this assignment was a very serious one, and she didn't want to even attempt it, for if she touched such a thing, a lot of things would change. The girl added that she had no guarantees, and she herself could not promise anything in this situation. She really sincerely did not want to do that. It wasn't because the task assigned to her was hard, but because of the influence the girl's power would have on her. That influence would be great, and something could unforeseeably go wrong. The responsibility for the result she did not want to bear. The girl was pulled out of her musings by the voice of the one in charge. The girl addressed her by name, saying that they were not gods. They could not do everything on their own. Filia wanted to object, but as soon as she had said half a sentence, she was interrupted again. The main one went on to say that the girl had powers that others didn't have, and she shouldn't forget that others also had their own role in this big theater. Priests should just carry comfort and support. Tears began to accumulate in Filia's eyes. The main one banged her empty cup on the tray sharply and loudly, saying that she thought Filia should go. The girl's voice sounded completely unemotional and cold when she said that. In Filia's eyes, the girl was at one with the high priest and wanted her dead. The abbess said that she too thought that Filia should go. Surprised at her words, Filia opened wide her eyes full of tears. The abbess raised Filia's bowed head and looked into her eyes. Taking the girl's face with both hands, the abbess said that it was time for the stop time to go again. Filia's eyes were full of tears. She could barely hold back from crying. Looking straight into Filia's eyes, the abbess told her to only do what she was sure she could do. It was hard for Filia to think about Akansara. She lowered her head into the Mother Superior's arms, comforting her. Someone in the room asked Filia if she had calmed down. It was clear from Filia's irritated look that she was not pleased with the person in front of her. However, as if not realizing this, the old man waved his hand cheerfully at Filia. Filia called the high priest a bloody old man, to which the old man resentfully replied that it was said out loud. Suddenly, Filia said she was going. The high priest asked again in surprise. Filia repeated that she was going to Akansar to see the mad prince. The high priest froze in shock while Filia was out of breath with anger. The high priest gestured for the prioress to ask the Mother Superior how she had convinced her, to which she replied with a thumbs up. The high priest remarked that this was an incredible skill, while Filia herself panted with indignation. Filia asked what she should do next, and the high priest looked at her thoughtfully. Looking away, Filia asked who she would go with if it was the high priest, but he said he wasn't allowed to go there. She looked at the high priest in surprise and wondered why he couldn't go with her, to which the old man replied that there were too many eyes there. The high priest told Filia not to worry, as he had already found someone she would go with, to which Filia got angry as everything was already prepared. She called the high priest meticulous. Annoyed, Filia said the sooner she left the better and asked who she would go with. The high priest said Diati. Filia was surprised. She opened her eyes wide. Filia asked again in horror. The high priest repeated that Diati would go with her. Her blonde hair was developing in the wind. The young boy stood, holding his cloak with one hand and the other covering his eyes from the sunlight, trying to see what lay ahead. Filia opened her eyes and mouth wide. She was horrified at the news of who would be traveling with her. She loudly questioned if it would really be him. The carriage made its way to the appointed place along the wooded road. Leaves were falling off the trees, and the sun was shining particularly bright. Birds perched on the branches were chirping about something of their own. Reflecting on the water, the sun's rays gave the forest river a special look. Frustrated, Filia looked somewhere in the distance. Suddenly, a carriage passed by, and someone from it exclaimed while Filia still sat pensively on the stone. "Someone got off the carriage." Something caught the stranger's eye. The stranger turned out to be the same Diati. He happily ran towards Filia while greeting her, calling her Angel Lily, but Filia jumped up and yelled at him, saying that she asked him not to call her that. Filia decided she needed to get this over with quickly. The preparations went smoothly. Shortly before leaving, the high priest summoned the traveler and protector in one person to the forest of Rose. Diati, stroking Filia's head, asked her if she was doing well while she angrily told him not to touch her and that they needed to sort things out quickly and return. Filia said that Diati was her traveling companion chosen by the high priest. Filia remembered what happened 3 months ago in Libanos next to this guy. Diati called out to her and she responded. Suddenly, Diati started talking about some kind of game, but Filia quickly refused, threatening that if he touched her he would die. Filia didn't like that trait in him. His open nature only made her uncomfortable. If she was a 10-year-old girl, she might have liked it. Diati started stroking her head again, asking her if she was living well, and Filia irritably removed his hand, repeating how many times she had told him not to touch her. In fact, Filia is 18 years old, and a 20-year-old guy who loves children and has a nice appearance was a weakness for her. Even in her dreams, Diati has no idea that Filia is much older than she looks. Embarrassed, Filia was pissed off by this attitude of Diati towards her. Upon reaching the church, Diati greeted the high priest and the prioress. Diadi introduced himself as his name and bowed to the prioress and high priest. The high priest cheerfully asked if Diadi was doing well, and the prioress bowed her head in greeting, just as Diadi had done. Looking at Diadi, the prioress thought that since he was called a fighter, he would be a scruffy and mean man. However, Diadi was handsome, well-built, and well-mannered. Suddenly, Diadi noticed that the abbess was staring at him. Diadi smiled kindly at the prioress. His smile was warm, and even he was glowing. The prioress liked Diadi. He had made a good impression on her with his fine manners. Now she was at ease with Filia. The high priest had boasted of his choice. Filia stood embarrassed next to Diadi, looking at the ground and clutching her dress in her hand. The prioress, noticing this, began to wonder why she didn't like it so much. Filia, sensing her gaze, desperately tried to pull her own away to avoid crossing paths with her. Diadi and the high priest walked behind while Filia and the prioress walked in front. The high priest asked if everything had been explained to him, to which Diadi said yes, but he didn't know the details. Filia was trying to hide from the prioress's gaze. Diadi asked if he could find out the details of the trip, to which the high priest said that it was better to keep it secret, for he himself realized who he was going to see. Diadi asked if they were talking about the runaway prince, and the high priest answered in the affirmative, saying that Filia was no ordinary child. They were silent for a moment, and Filia looked at them nervously. As soon as Diadi and the high priest looked at her, she averted her gaze. Diadi wanted to say something, but Filia interrupted him, ordering him to stop. Diadi wanted to ask something, but the old man already knew what Diadi would ask and just confirmed his guess. Diadi was shocked. He wondered if it was possible since the prince was insane, and even if it was true. With a pat on his shoulder, the old man asked to protect Filia so that she could find the reason for the prince's madness. Diadi nodded firmly, letting her know that he would not leave her in trouble. Now Diadi understood why he would be given a promotion, for this situation was very different from a normal escort. The old man and Diadi began to be perplexed as to how they could be promoted for such a job. The city of heroes located on the border of the Allion power, Libanos, and now there is a war progressing, and wars are fought with wild beasts conquering territories. Even in war, promotion is only given to the brave, while Diadi gets it for such a simple job. Filia thought in horror, why would a man who has been involved in such dangerous adventures be sent on an escort? Diadi asked her if she was going to stop the prince, to which the girl replied in the affirmative. Diadi said that in the last 6 months, more than 3 people have died at the hands of the prince. Filia was shocked. She asked what Diadi meant by that. Diadi, scratching the back of his head, asked Filia if she knew. After all, everyone knows about it. But Filia shouted in anger that it was the first time she heard it. The high priest who hid it from her slowly walked away. Diadi, with a smile on his face, told Filia to be careful as he might as well kill. Filia was horrified at this information in wild shock. While Filia couldn't come to her senses from the shock, Diadi glowered, having said such a creepy thing, and the high priest continued to distance himself. Felicia asked again what Diadi meant. The sun was still shining just as brightly. Birds were flying near the church. The serene sunny morning, clear skies and coolness beckoned as the sunlight brightly illuminated the land. The sunlight snaked through the leaves, reaching the forest path, the dewdrops glistening like glitter as the rays hit them. And in all this beautiful rose blossom forest, someone was spoiling the atmosphere. Filia began the conversation by saying that they should have explained her being sent to Ankansar again while she was carried in her arms, holding her shoulders tightly, for if she walked on her own feet, she would make an attempt to escape. She cried out that this was wrong. Why should she be sent to such a dangerous place, while her hearers followed her peacefully, escorting her to the carriage? 20 minutes ago, Filia had already made an attempt to escape through the window, but she was spotted in time. She was caught by an attendant 5 seconds later and was grabbed by the scruff of her neck, to which she was clearly outraged. And now she is left to shed tears, repeating that no one warned her of this danger. The high priest told her that he would not have sent her to her death, but Filia immediately replied that this was not the first time he had stabbed her in the back by pointing a finger at him. The high priest couldn't find the words for his outrage as Filia reiterated tearfully that how could a child be sent to such a deadly place? As she looked at the roses, she suddenly asked the prioress to remember, looking at the red roses, how beautiful Lily had died young and beautiful. But the prioress, looking at this spectacle, only thought that the girl was overdoing it. The tears only increased with renewed vigor. Still, injustice is a strong blow. Filia turned to the high priest, and he responded. Filia asked the high priest if he was sure that Ero Elion was the man from the prophecy. The high priest immediately replied that he firmly believed this, and Filia had another question, which was whether the Lord really wanted this prophecy not to come true. The high priest was surprised, while a wicked smile shone on the face carried in her arms by Filia. However, the high priest interrupted the thoughts in her head, saying that he was not sending her to thwart the prophecy. Filia, of course, asked many questions about what she was being sent there for, to which she received the answer that it was so that the prophecy would be fulfilled correctly. He went on to say that the priests were too insignificant to interfere in the drastic changes of the country, but there was still something they could influence, and it was the stream within, if you were there. In turn, Filia said that all she needed was to eat well and live alone, to which the high priest replied that how could something so shameless exist? Filia agreed that a servant of the Lord should still help people, but asked for some time to prepare for the trip, but the high priest said he could not do that. The next words caught everyone by surprise. He said that the prince had already given the order to march. Filia was about to ask again, but the high priest beat her to it, saying that she didn't have to worry because the prince wouldn't start the attack until he got there. And Filia asked the reason for that decision. With a wide smile on his face, the high priest said that the prince was waiting for Filia, which Filia herself was not happy about. Filia immediately pounced with questions to explain why he was waiting for her. The high priest answered all of Filia's questions. He explained that in order to start a war, you need a priest's permission, a wake, repentance, and an official announcement. But Filia didn't even know how to conduct a wake, but the high priest replied that she didn't need to know. Filia was puzzled about what she should do, why she was going there, but the high priest gave her clear instructions that she should just delay the rebellion and take advantage of the moment to understand the prince's soul. But Filia still didn't understand what they wanted from her. But one thing she realized for sure was that the prince wouldn't like it. To which the high priest waved his index finger from side to side as if to say, "No, no." The high priest, with a satisfied look, replied that that was why he had Diade assigned to Filia. Thoughts flashed through Filia's mind that it was so dangerous that he had sent Diade with her, and she was convinced that the high priest was a crazy grandfather. Taking Filia from Diade by the scruff of her neck, the high priest said it was time for her to go, and no matter how much she resisted, the high priest pronounced that tears would not help matters. A moment later, he threw her into the carriage, closing the door sharply so that she could not escape. While the high priest was watching Filia, who was desperately knocking at the window in the carriage door, the prioress was handing things over and explaining to Filia's attendant what she should not eat and how many times a day she should be fed. Suddenly, Filia moved the carriage window aside. The high priest pulled out a scroll and began to tell a furious Filia that he was borrowing the Holy Scripture, saying that he had inherited this copy from the master himself. But Filia had little interest in this. She only shouted at him that his lord would punish him, but the high priest calmly said that Filia would receive the blessing and take the punishment himself. Shoving the scroll in Filia's face and taking her by surprise, the carriage moved, and she was unable to escape, and only a cry of failure was heard from the carriage. As the cry grew stronger and stronger, the abbess and the high priest waved at the carriage, and Diade bade them farewell in return. And so, to the loud curses of Filia, they set off under the autumn sky, heading towards Aksankar for the prince. The trail of the carriage wheels left on the ground was showered with autumn red leaves. Diade sat by the reins in absolute silence. Only the clatter of the wheels and the clatter of the horses broke it. Suddenly, Diade himself felt uncomfortable with this oppressive silence. He turned to Filia, asking if she was all right, but all he got was silence. He called out to her, and she said not to speak to him. Diade turned back to see what condition Filia was in. Filia was sitting with her knees drawn up and her head down, and it was obvious that she was not happy with what was happening. Diade thought about how he could cheer her up. He stopped at a tree that had not yet completely changed color. It was green in some places, yellow in some places, orange in others. Diade cut a piece of pie and, placing it on a napkin, offered it to Filia. The piece of pie glistened seductively in Diade's hands, beckoning the teary-eyed Filia to take it. Suddenly, Filia raised her hand and showed her fingers too, suggesting that she needed 2 slices. Diade realized this at once and began to cut off the second slice. Sitting on a large roadside rock, Filia ate the pie while Diade watched her. After the pie, Filia became more talkative and asked how long the journey would take, to which she replied that it would be about 2 days. Then she asked if the road would be safe, for the journey to Ankansar was full of dangers. Diety answered Filia's questions that maybe the road is a bit congested because many people come to Akansar, and agreed with what she said about the rebellion members. Filia asked Diat about the road to Akansar, about those planning to come and participate in the rebellion. Suddenly she asked why if they were dissatisfied with the country they would go to the prince, to which she received the answer that they considered him their last hope, thinking he was different. Finishing the cake in an angry impulse, Filia thought that this prince was no different. He had also killed a man. Suddenly the words of the high priest came to her mind, about whether she would not care when Ankansar was covered in blood. She had already answered that question to herself. She cared, but the blood had already been spilled, Filia reflected. She gave herself the realization that she owed them a debt of gratitude, and that's why she was going there, to stop it, as suddenly she began to be stroked on the head. Diati comfortingly stroked her head, watching her reaction. Diati remarked that young Lily had a lot on her mind and suggested that she start thinking today about what she was going to do there, but Faria questioned what he meant, to which Diati went on to say that the matter was complicated, and so it was better to think about what Filia was going to do now. Filia grudgingly replied that she was already putting her best foot forward, to which Deity said that who knows, for Filia was now immersed in worries. Suddenly, he leaned towards her, pointing at the pie, and told Filia that she had not finished it yet. Filia was embarrassed, and her face turned red. She looked thoughtfully at the piece of pie in her hands. Diati had told her that the journey was a long one, and that Filia would have to eat the whole thing to get through it. He also told her not to worry too much and added that he would take her home safely. Filia noticed that Diati was emphasizing the safe and sound, asking him if he thought that was possible. Suddenly Diati wondered if it was possible. Filia became wary. Suddenly, Diati joyfully told her that in Libanos, if the bones are intact, they say that you are unharmed, and in his understanding it means safe and sound, but Filia was not reassured. Suddenly, Diati laughed, saying it was only a joke and he would protect her, but Filia angrily asked if that was how he was going to protect her and shouted not to laugh. Having spent half a day on the road since leaving Rose, the sun was already fading below the horizon, leaving them to the darkness of the dangerous wasteland. By nightfall, they had reached the border of Ankansar, where there could be danger and life-threatening danger at every turn. Nightfall, the carriage drove at full speed out of the gorge. Dust rose up from behind the carriage. The horses ran with their ears perked up. Focusing on the road, Diati tried to accelerate as fast as possible. Suddenly, a multitude of arrows shot into the sky. At once, all the arrows started hitting the carriage. Filia, who was in the carriage, screamed in terror. Filia screamed in fear to help her. Diati told her to move to the front of the carriage as she could be hit by an arrow at the back. Leaning against the window of the carriage, Filia screamed in terror at Diati for telling her she would be safe, to which Diati replied with a wide smile that she would be safe because he had promised. Filia started yelling that she was worried about him and that he should stop laughing and watch the road. But Diati kept laughing, and Filia's hunch that getting there safely was not the same as getting there safely was justified. The road was dry, the sun was setting, the sky was a little cloudy, and Filia was thinking about the fact that a few hours before sunset, she felt the scenery begin to change as she approached a Kansu town, where she and Brother Dilly were headed. The church attendant and her guard were driving to their destination in a rather nice carriage for the area, and at the same time attracting quite a bit of attention from others due to their more solid appearance. Angel Rose, who has not seen such a picture for a long time, looks through the carriage window at the tired and angry-looking people who are camping on the road she and her companion are traveling through. The lady priestess, who sees the whole picture, shrinks from the unpleasant feeling and crosses her arms and prays to God for the safe crossing of the place. The high-class carriage was expectedly eye-catching, and it led too. The horses' hooves, which had been pulling the expensive carriage for a long time without rest, began to gallop even faster on the ground, moving with the sand, running away from the chase and saving the lives of their masters that could at any moment say goodbye to the world. Diati, who played the role of coachman, was doing his best to control the horses, being as concentrated as possible and shouting various phrases from time to time so that the horses would go faster and would not harm him or the priestess sitting there. And those who chased them were people almost completely covered in clothes, starting from long pants, ending with something that completely covered their face, leaving only a little space for the eyes, and some on top of such a headdress put on a kind of hood, apparently, for better concealment. A bunch of arrows of unknown people flew at a fairly fast speed towards the carriage, inside which was an important servant of the lord and brother Didi from the city of warriors, who was on the role of coachman, guard, and examiner. Filia and Diadi had left the expensive carriage with their belongings inside, already pierced with arrows, hoping to get away from the pursuit, thinking that the pursuers needed the things inside. Except that a bunch of warriors, completely covered in clothes, bypassing the seemingly valuable carriage with swords and bows in their hands, continued to pursue the warrior from Ravonis and the priestess that had to give her consent to the war that the third prince of Elaon was about to wage. Surprised at the masked men continuing to pursue them even after dropping their cargo, Angel Rosie shouted at them with a finger pointing at them, and Didi's brother turned around in surprise. The unknown people that came for the souls of the two from the monastery with swords in their hands were chasing them. And Filia, at this in her mind, incredulously confirmed the fact that they continued to chase them without reacting to the things that they left to the strangers in their so-called care. The guard hailing from the city of warriors, seeing all this, not the sweetest situation for them, running away, asked the priestess to climb on his back, to which she exclaims in surprise. And so the bowstring of the wooden bows of the fighter was again drawn, preparing to attack, and some already shot arrows in the direction of the two poor, only doing their duty young men, who are not even 21. Lily, who has clung to the warrior and is slightly in front of him, facing the enemies, sees that arrows are flying at them, which are about to hurt one of them very badly, if not fatally. A moment before the arrows are about to pierce them, Didi changes the position of the one she is guarding, redirecting her to her back, on which the arrows are about to fly, to which the priestess herself was indignant and shouted that it was not much. But the warrior, who might very soon be raised to the level of commander, knew what to do. His eyes looked confident enough, as he himself did, as he made a swing of his sword that left a beautiful trail in the air, flipping over in an instant to be able to fend off the arrows that flew at them, and eventually doing so, protecting himself, the horse and Lily with one good swing of the sword. The priestess with hair like cotton candy, who already had tears at the corners of her eyes from fear for her and Didi's lives, clung tightly to the guard's back and clenched her eyes shut, opening one eye to see the whole situation. Actually, after she saw all these miracles with her own eyes, the same eyes fell out of orbits, and she looked so surprised, as if she saw how a chicken was recognized as the most brilliant creature of the earth. And the reason for this shock was that Brother D.D. had fended off a lot of arrows, and was on horseback with her on his back, which Lily had thought impossible, which it was in practice. But Diadi himself looked cool enough, unlike the frightened priestess of the monastery. The warrior, analyzing the situation, realized that the pursuers had a different goal, and was there any point in engaging in combat? Suddenly, their attackers suddenly turned and began to run back, which was quite surprising and unexpected for someone who only a minute ago was fighting them off, and not just for a warrior. The priestess with pink hair that looked like cotton candy was also surprised by this outcome, and looked with interest at those who now had their hooves glistening, and it was not clear why. Questioning why they had retreated, both companions wondered, until they turned in the direction they had originally headed and saw a huge army on horseback with flags and torches strongly visible. A bunch of warriors in high-class armor and with various weapons, on trained horses that, just like the humans, were covered in iron and chainmail in some places. The army shouted loudly and clearly that they had come to meet and escort the priest from Rosie's monastery. Lily was clearly overjoyed at the appearance of the third prince's knights and managed to exhale a sigh of relief as her companion, who had been protecting all this time, fought off enemies whose purpose was not particularly clear. And so the knights and the two from Noe's monastery, in no particular hurry, approached each other on trusty steeds to negotiate, and that Leo Elaion's army would be able to further escort the priestess. Having finally managed to calm down and catch her breath, Filia, who was shaking with tears of both joy and fear, thought that they were alive. And Diadi remained almost the same in appearance, and looked at the third Prince Leo's army with a sigh. Warriors in armor, on horseback, with white flags with black patterns painted on them, with torches so it wouldn't be dark, as befitted the nighttime, with red cloaks were approaching the two who had just broken away from the chase. Shaitan, guarding Filia, with a smile and lightness on her face, looking up at Angel. Rosé, who was now all in tears, whispered about whether the priestess could see that he had, as promised, kept Lily safe and sound. She peered at the structure with uncertainty and a kind of fear, not getting out of the cloak of the night. That same night had saved her life and gone through the whole painstaking process with her. Then followed the irritated words of the shocked priestess that Braddock will definitely be struck by lightning someday by the Lord, and the one to whom these words were addressed only laughed light-heartedly and sweetly. It is already morning on the territory that is close to the castle of the well-known third prince, about whom all over the empire there are malicious and not the most pleasant rumors. The sun rises and is slightly blinding, and the ground is as if it has long since dried up and lifeless, on which no plant can sprout. The sun's rays fall on the white castle, which looks quite sturdy and strong. Above the castle's eye-catching, heavy-looking, and robust gates hangs the coat of arms of this fortress in white and black, approached by Sister Lily and Brother Didi with the third prince's army. The priestess, who had fallen asleep on the road after a difficult moment for her, is awakened by her guard in a soft voice, calling her by her title, after which she wakes up in no particular hurry after a clearly not the sweetest sleep. The warrior smilingly explains to the priestess that they have already arrived, while the servant of the Lord rubs her eyes and tries to wake up, then sees what is happening with her eyes wide open. It is a white, majestic, and large fortress that is 10 times longer than the 10-year-old body of the priestess, who came into the hands of the monastery 8 years ago at the age of 11, and until now has rarely been outside its walls. She looks at the structure with uncertainty and a certain fear, not getting out from under the cloak of the knight who saved her life that night and went through this painstaking process with her. As if doomed to look at all this girl that is in the body of a 10-year-old, says the words, "So that's where they are," and her knight supporting the dialogue. With a smile and a light tone, says that the priestess from the convent yesterday was not easy. Expressive eyes belonging to the clearly tired-of-it-all girl slightly covered, and hair the color of delicate millet covered part of the face of Angel Rose. Finally, the bulky gates of the white as snow-majestic fortress opened, giving way to the army of the third prince Leo Eleon, and they in turn began to gradually go inside this fortress. The priestess and warrior from the No monastery were the ones who entered among those who were first, which is logical, considering they are the reason why this troop was sent out. Before they went in, Didi suggested that Lily pray before going in, to which the lady priestess agreed with the words that if things got really bad, it might be her last prayer, to which Diadi asked why she would do that since he was there for her, but only Filia replied that she didn't trust him anymore. While the two were talking, 3 silhouettes could be seen coming out of the gate. One of them was a man in an officer's uniform with black, slightly wavy hair and sharp features in both eyes and face. He rode his horse with firm confidence toward the priestess from the convent and her companion. As he left the gate, the brunette sat on his trusty steed with confidence and calmness, while the knights that accompanied the priestess greeted him with palms to his temple as they should. Filia herself, seeing him and the reaction of the warriors as they greeted the black-haired young man, thought maybe he was some kind of commander, or the prince himself, whom she was so afraid of because of the bad rumors about the identity of the third of the princes. The first thing Lily supposed Prince asked was the whereabouts of the priest, to which the knight who had been asked was clearly uncomfortable, apparently because of the priest's youthful appearance. This was followed by the answer of the soldier who had been asked that the lady priestess was over there, and a glance in the direction of the lady priestess Lily. And the warrior added that it was that little girl, pointing to the 10-year-old body of Filia, who had to arrive in such a form because of the power too great for this world, because it was much easier to control the foresight and all that is associated with it. The one to whom the words were intended was quite surprised by this, and did not even begin to hide his shock at this outcome of events. He looked in the direction of the guard, who was from the city of warriors and a priestess from the No monastery, and exclaimed loudly, "What?" Even though it wasn't very polite to their guests. Sitting beside Didi's brother was Filia, who was completely wrapped up in his cloak and clinging to him like a cat, which looked pretty cute. and considering that they had been on horseback for a long time, this would be the most comfortable position. Seeing all this picture, the brunette with wavy hair was in a great shock, from which even his jaw slightly dropped and his eyes became unnaturally large square in shape. The fair-haired and pretty priestess with stars in her eyes and undisguised interest looked at the young gentleman and asked him if he was the prince. But such a reaction was only on the part of Angel Rosa. The very person on whom Lily showed interest was extremely discouraged and in great shock at what he saw, so much so that he did not even try to hide his emotions, which could well offend anyone. The horses were right next to each other, and the atmosphere in the air was not the most pleasant. While the black-eyed man was shocked by this, Lily and Diddy were completely calm and just waited. There was no telling how shocked the newly arrived man was, as he was stunned at the ridiculous expression on his face, and the thought that the priest who should give his consent to the war was a girl. Seeing this man in uniform, the lady priestess Filia, who has only recently awakened, stares at him for a while and then gazes into his eyes. Not even 4 seconds pass as she reads the soul of her so-called interlocutor, who was rude enough to show his side to the guest. After reading it, Lily realized that the man in front of her was no prince. The resentment was evident, but in spite of such strong emotions, he still did not say a single word about the whole situation, which was unexpected. Turning away, he ordered the wheat-colored girl to the fortress where they were going. At this behavior, Lily only noticed that he turned away, but her thoughts were interrupted by a voice from outside with a but. He clearly corrected the soldier's mistake by saying that it was not the girl, but the clergyman, and then again gave the order to take her and her companion who was protecting the priestess, to which the soldiers only shouted, "Yes!" And then the eyes of the one who gave the order and the eyes of the one who was touched by those words met, but they did not exchange a word. Both were on horseback, and both were playing a rather large role right now. Filia was quite surprised, but in a strange and pleasant way, after she could read the soul of the soldier that was in front of her only for a moment. But that moment was enough for her to understand what was in his soul. The young man glanced at the priestess and her companion over his back, and then set off ahead of the last two. In the sunset light, the two horses stepped confidently across the wooden bridge. The sharp contours of their silhouettes foreshadow an important confrontation or the beginning of a dangerous adventure. Filia and Diati, riding one of these horses and looking around, the boy guided the horse by the reins, and in front of him sat a small girl. They were wary, because they did not know what they would face once they entered the castle grounds. The sun was already showing its last rays of sunlight. The warriors in armor breathlessly looked at the arriving guests. They had obviously been guarding the ancient castle for quite a long time, and were always ready for the attack of the shadows of the night. The travelers had almost driven in. Diati was all but staring at the clouds that were in the distance, and Filia behind was clearly worried she still couldn't accept what was happening now. In the twilight of the old city, the mysterious citizens of the city hiding their faces under hoods, they were worried about the arrival of the mysterious guests. Filia pressed her lips together and lowered her head, trying to hide her excitement. She really didn't like this kind of attention from the people around her to herself. She wanted to get to the castle quickly to get some rest from the road. The castle guard stood at the entrance with a spear and shield in his hands. As dusk fell, he was firmly guarding the passageway and was constantly ready for battle. From the outside, the castle did indeed look splendid, with unwavering guards with weapons standing by the stone pillars, staring at the newly arrived guests. But, unfortunately, there was an oppressive atmosphere inside, and because of that, Filia felt a strange sense of discomfort, so she and her companion Didi always remained on guard. Unlike the boy, who seemed to be very calm, the girl kept her eyes on the guards, and they made her very tense just by their mere appearance. As the travelers went deeper and deeper into the fortress, Filia began to notice that they had not yet met a single girl, although by this time the maids should have already begun their work. And this made the little girl very curious, for the guards were very surprised to see her, the only girl in the castle, which made Filia think that there were no women in the fortress, although there must have been many women among the refugees to work in the fortress. Suddenly, one of the knights informed that His Highness the Prince was now on his way, and for now, he would escort Filia in place with his companion Diati to separate chambers. From this information, the girl's eyes lit up. She dreamed of a room where she could finally rest. Against this background, she did not even hear her companion explain that one room would be enough for them. But Deity, unlike Filia, was in no hurry to rest. He raised his finger, showing the guards that he had something else he wanted to say, and it happened so suddenly that the tired girl was even surprised. The guy informed the guards that until the priestess gets used to this place, he would always stay by her side. The guards were even taken aback by such a statement, and Filia couldn't understand who could order such nonsense. Deity continued to rub the knights that the girl is uncomfortable alone in unfamiliar places, and this has finally made the priestess furious. Calm and caring, the guy's gaze literally asked that whether the girl can sleep in a place where she's surrounded everywhere by men unfamiliar to her. And the crazy look of the girl literally answered him. No matter how it was, the warrior himself came to her as a strange man, and with him she would also be afraid to be alone. The guards accepted it because they saw that Filia was a child after all, and such a precaution was quite adequate from the side of her escort, and this moment made the girl very angry because she knew that she was not a child at all. But in the end, the priestess resigned herself, for at the moment she wanted to rest more than to prove anything. She looked at everything with a weary look and slowly went to the chambers, keeping the last hope that she would be lodged separately from Deity. But in the end, the companions were put together. The guard inclined his head and said that he realized how tired the guests were after their long journey, so they should rest now, and after resting, he promised to make sure that food was served to them. Filia caught herself thinking that she had no time to be angry now, so she suppressed her anger and calmly entered the room where she would soon be staying in place with her companion. In the room of the ancient castle, where time seemed to stand still, hung a majestic chandelier that softly illuminated the golden carved panels. Each diamond on it held secrets of the past. As the morning light began to filter into the room, it was clear that most of the furniture in the room was under dusty sheets. There was a cracked, gilded antique mirror. Once someone had looked into it, but now it was also covered in dust. She began to see a mustachioed nobleman in an austere suit, with a cigar in his hands, sitting on a red sofa and talking about something important with the girls in elegant dresses who surrounded him. But as soon as the girl blinked, the room was empty. The furniture in front was covered with the same dusty sheets, and there was no one in the room except her and Daddy. The priestess was stunned, and she stopped her gaze at one point, trying to understand what had just happened. Her companion noticed it at once, so he called out to her to ask if everything was all right. When the little girl realized that someone was calling her, she sharply turned her head back, and on the guy's questions about whether everything was all right, because she hovered for a moment, she hurriedly replied that everything was fine, and most likely it was from fatigue, although deep down she was wondering what had just happened to her. She ran sharply to the guard and asked the guard, who had not yet left the chambers of the newly arrived guests, when she would be able to see the prince. The guard explained that His Majesty should be back by noon because he would be leaving to hunt the local black wolves. For there were many wolves in Akansar, especially black wolves. Their eyes glowed bright yellow in the darkness, like street lamps or fire torches. At this time, memories began to slowly return to Filia. And now, even if the priestess tries her best to look away, this place makes her realize the truth. Now the girl was already beginning to realize that she had really come here, to this ancient fortress. Right here in Akansar. The sun had almost set over the horizon. A long and peaceful night lay ahead. The guests were already in their chambers, and Filia slowly began to drift off to sleep. In the magic hall, illuminated by thousands of lights that emitted chandeliers made of precious stones, couples were dancing. Their movements were harmonious and full of joy. Illuminated by soft light, they seemed to hover in the space of eternal beauty and love. In the magnificent hall where the ball was held, a lady with a fan, hiding a smile, exchanged glances with a gentleman. He raised a glass of rose wine, perhaps proposing a toast to their secret union. The lights twinkled around them, and the music promised a night of mystery and enchantment. The hall where everyone was in a marvelous mood. Light enveloped the musicians. The vibrato of the bow merged with the resonance of the wood. Harmony came alive, capturing the hearts of the audience. Passion and talent united in one inspired movement. It was obvious that the people gathered there were having a very good time. Filia's gaze was calm. Now she did not understand where she was and what was going on. She guessed that it was just another conduct, but despite that, her eyes looked straight into the water. The girl was already standing among the gentlemen. She was shocked because she had appeared here among them very suddenly, Now she had to find out where she was and what the vision was preparing for her. The priestess had her first clue that she was now in the past. Of course, this place was no more magnificent than Akansar, but clearly nobler than it. What immediately caught Filia's eye was the coat of arms of the place she was now in. The symbol on the coat of arms contained an eagle on a pure white insignia. This symbol was the symbol of the prince himself. Hence, a second guess immediately appeared in the girl's mind that this one belonged to the prince himself. But the problem was that Filia had never been to the capital before, so the girl could not understand how she now sees this ball because she had no idea about it. Meanwhile, in the grand ballroom, under the light of crystal chandeliers, guests in lavish robes were still dancing. The center of attention was a mysterious tall guy who was surrounded by all the women who had come there. Angel Rosa, due to her small stature, could stand through the guests and a little peek. What is this mysterious guy who so attracted attention stood there now, right in the center, among all the guests? She held her breath in anticipation to see the face of this mystery man. Slowly the heads of the ladies who stood right next to the mysterious guy and tried to talk to him nicely parted, and from behind them began to peek out a head with elegant black curls. One of the girls turned to the guy, calling him Your Highness, and then it became clear that this mysterious young man was none other than the prince himself, the very prince about whom now there were many rumors, and for whose sake Filia and his partner went on such a long journey. The prince's head turned fully, and Filia saw his face. The lad had perfectly white skin like pearls, and his calm eyes, the color of cornflowers, were now looking directly at the priestess. At the moment, Your Majesty, the prince was completely calm. Suddenly through the dream, someone began to call out to the girl. It was clearly with the purpose of waking her up, but she did not want to wake up yet. Filia put her hands in front of her face, thus showing that now there is this dream, needing more than staying in reality. Slowly the priestess began to wake up and already come out of sleep. On her face, from what she had just seen, drops of sweat appeared. She looked in one exactly that, to come to her senses faster, and above her stood excited Diati, who was frightened to notice that his companion, very long, could not come out of sleep. The guy immediately began to ask Filia if she was all right and if she had a nightmare, but she just got off the bed, sat on the floor, and putting her head on the bed, began to think about what she had just seen. The image of such a noble-looking prince and the way he looked at her in that dream had been lodged in her mind, so she was even more interested to know what Your Highness looked like now, after he had gone mad. The girl put her hand on her forehead and began to ponder what she could call what she was seeing. The girl realized that it wasn't like a dream at all, and another thought popped into her head that it could be a memory that she could see because of her ability. Filia's power has been sealed for a long time, and that's most likely why these memories could be precipitous. But instead, in her dreams, the girl often sees more accurate memories and secrets. She thought it was sort of to compensate. She didn't realize that it was the memories of the man who had met them, because she had heard someone address him as, Your Highness. Then was it really the prince she was supposed to meet? The priestess asked the knight what time it was, and he replied that it was about 12 o'clock in the afternoon. The girl sat on the bed all disheveled, and even without looking at the dialogue with Diati, continued to think. She had another theory that this memory could be one of the brothers that died at the hands of the prince. Diati suggested that Filia get some more sleep. As he realized that the girl might be very tired from the road, but the priestess explained that she had already slept enough. The girl reminded that the prince should have arrived by noon. Her companion replied that it was true, and the prince would soon be at the castle. Filia sat down on the edge of the bed and began to tie up her red hair. Suddenly, the two companions heard a strange noise from the street. The noise was so loud that it could be heard even in the room where the windows were closed. To find out what was going on, Diati immediately went to the window, trying to see what was causing such a commotion. Looking out the window, he saw the riders and the prince returning from a hunt, and it seemed to be a very successful one, because they had caught something. In the square, riders on horses after the hunt. In front sat a large bearded man with a pile of arrows behind his back, and right behind him on the horse lay a large black, by the look of already killed wolf. Filia excitedly asked the knight if they were wolves, because she could only get a slight glimpse of what was going on outside the window. Diati confirmed the priestess's guesses. He also suggested that most likely now, the prince had returned from the hunt, and may even be in the castle. There was a sudden knock in the room, and their attention immediately turned to the front door. Filia was a little frightened by this surprise, and her companion, Knight Diati, was a little wary. The white door with gold inlays opened, and a guard with a weapon entered the room, followed by a man's voice, who began to explain that he was a little busy and unfortunately would not be able to introduce himself properly. After these words, a dark-haired, formally dressed man entered the room. He put his palm on his chest and introduced himself as Himas, namely as an aide to His Highness the Prince himself. To the guests, he seemed like a very ordinary man despite his status. He had sharp features and a serious expression. He was polite but kept his distance, moderately stern and cold-blooded. But despite this, Filia's abilities let her discern that this calm and elegant image of a man was only his shell, and inside he was a completely different person. Mr. Himas had been born into a noble family, but had subsequently been banished. The man had always been characterized by his pride, and it was only because of his true character that he became the prince's aide, his aristocratic family being his best means of expression. He presented himself as the most typical official, but the man wasn't arrogant. He was usually strict and old-fashioned, and sometimes even a bit timid. One way or another, he was a difficult-to-communicate principled man. Because of this kind of analysis, many questions were leaving Filia's mind. Suddenly, the brown-eyed Himas's stern gaze went straight into Filia's large eyes. Only now there was something different in his eyes, and that something was like confusion. The priestess, who was much shorter than the official, stared into his gaze with her big blue eyes, trying to make out his motives and what he was about to say to her. The man abruptly lowered himself to the girl's level without losing eye contact with her, which surprised Filia a little as she began to notice that the man was clearly preparing to say something to her. And then Mr. Himas said that he had heard about Filia from the high priest before. The girl answered unequivocally, but in her mind, she was very surprised that the high priest had warned the man for some reason. From the excitement of Mr. Himas on his face were drops of sweat, and from that strict man who, from the beginning, came into the room to the guests no trace, he also admitted that his first impression of the high priest was disgusting. Filia did not understand why the man began to change so drastically in behavior, and why so afraid to speak his mind about her mentor. Also, the girl could not believe that the high priest was familiar with Himas beforehand. The look of the priestess was changing. In her big, sparkling eyes, there was as if realizing something. She could not understand what was going wrong with the man who, a second ago, was completely calm, and she could not understand about whom he was trying to tell her now. The girl realized that Himas had started talking about the high priest. Now she realized how this old man knew about everything in Akansar, and it also made her think that he must have met with the prince's aides before. The priestess timidly turned her head to the side, but she did not take her eyes off the official's eyes. It seemed to her that this grown-up and very proud man was about to cry like a child. Mr. Himas was so nervous that sparks were falling from his eyes as well as tears, though the man frowned his eyebrows and tried his best to remain calm. The man's gaze literally drilled into the girl. She was furious that he literally believed that she was the Angel of Rose, sent by the high priest to heal His Highness the Prince. Filia found such behavior burdensome to her. She did not understand that Himas met with the high priest without the knowledge of the prince. It turns out that he was not so loyal to him and was ready to prevent him in secret from him, or on the contrary, it was all for the sake of His Majesty. Of course, for a man who was extremely loyal to his country, and the emperor to stop the prince was very much to be expected. And the mad prince was very lucky to have such proper servants around him. According to rumors, the prince, who was like a beast torn by sharp thorns, was going to destroy the country, and then the main question came up: what did the protagonist of the prophecy that everyone tried to help him so much? Then if to think so, we can remember the words of the high priest who said that there are no unreasonably mad people, and if the prince had already attacked, most likely nobody would be interested in the reason and motives of it. By the way, the formerly famous Akansar had been abandoned for 8 years. The prophecy also spoke of the destruction of Akansar itself. After this small dialogue, Himas hurried out of the room, asking the guests to change the prince's mind. Filia and Diati looked at the official with understanding, their gaze showing that they would try to do their best. After all, they had traveled almost halfway across the country for a reason, and it would be very foolish to give up now. Filia was already determined to help in any way she could, because if she had already come here and was standing right now in this fortress, she should at least try to do something. There was only the unknown ahead. No one knew what to expect from the mad prince. The only images in her mind were of him sitting majestically on his throne and looking down on everyone with a smirk. The third prince's 2 guests and his aide stood in front of a huge door that was surrounded by 2 guards about to enter, looking very small compared to the size of the door in the room. Himas, who had come to escort Filia and Diati to Leo Elion, said with a slightly worried look that His Highness the Prince was waiting for them there. And Lily and Diddy, who had been preparing for this meeting for a long time, were about to enter and looked unperturbed, despite their fear that everything would go wrong. The guards, wearing a pile of heavy but durable armor, who were near the huge gateway doors, each took one handle and began to open it, allowing Angel Rosa to see what was in there. The one in front of whom the huge door was open looked calm and collected enough, with thoughts of whether the prince had killed his brothers, whether he was hurt by the thorns, he was still human, and that it was necessary to finish the job as soon as possible to find out what was wrong and solve the problem. The impatient tapping of the beautifully horrible fingers on which the blood-stained black glove fit perfectly against the golden cover of the seat on which the third prince was now sitting. The beautiful and rich-looking upper part of the throne that was studded with various patterns, decorated with various high-class jewels, and as if made of pure gold, and so the head of the third prince, which the whole empire called a monster, saying that he had such a guest for the first time. Suddenly Priestess Filia was stunned, seeing this whole picture, as if with real horror and lack of understanding in her eyes and throughout her body. It was the first time that the priest's apprentice stood stunned, looking at the third prince, whom recently she was so afraid of, and the prince himself, so confidently seated on the throne and looking at the priestess with a degree of arrogance. The gaze of the third prince Aleon was like the eyes of a ravenous, hungry wolf about to pounce on its prey, and which by its mere presence inspired a piercing fear in everyone present. The dark-haired and blue-eyed Arrow Elliot, dressed in dark clothes with fur, looking at Filia with a smug grin and interest, looking tired and as if he hadn't slept for days. The thoughts of the one he was looking at were that she had seen him in a dream. Suddenly, the priestess of the No convent, looking directly into Leo's eyes, activates her ability, and she is struck with either horror or other, not the most pleasant feelings that came in a short moment with the words, "My king." With the help of these powers, she sees a vague picture of a girl who looks suspiciously like her, but with a mature physique, holding in her hands the one who so strongly resembles the older third prince Leo. A short snippet of not clearly future, flashbacks or whatever, eye contact between Filia and Leo, a look that looked as horrifying as the rumors about him, his actions, and the rest of his image. A look that seemed to appraise the priestess that came from faraway lands, a look that underestimated his opponent. The words that even if his thorns pierced her, she would be fine echoed in the mind of Priestess Lily, who through her powerful ability could see various things that ordinary people were not aware of. The words continued to echo in the head of Angel Rosa, who was clearly not well, and this time it was said that she would be reborn again. Frequent and heavy breathing that broke, cold sweat retreating down her body, and a tongue that she didn't control as well as her body at that moment. The words in her head continued on that she would find him. Lily cried out in full force, covering her ears with her hands as if she didn't want to continue hearing those incomprehensible words. The voice that ended her speech saying that people should not lose their heads to the crown of thorns as it happened to them. This shout, which did not last very long, was heard in almost every corner of such a large palace fortress, which, despite its magnificent appearance, was quite uncomfortable and not cozy, as Lily noticed. The knights standing at the door were stunned and a little concerned at such a sudden outcry from the little girl who had just entered the hall where the third prince was sitting. The black-haired prince with blue eyes and bags under his eyes, which made him look like a living dead man, did not expect such a thing. He stared at the little girl with interest, calmness, and not understanding why she was behaving like that. Ada Himas, with dark brown hair, whose eyes had grown big again, stared in surprise at Lily, as did the knight who stood just behind him in case of a surprise attack on Prince Arrow Arrowit. Didi's brother, the guard that protects the priestess of the god sent by the No monastery, who was standing next to Filia, also looked at Lily with his mouth slightly open and not understanding what had happened to her. And the priestess herself, who immediately came to her senses and covered her mouth with her hands so that it wouldn't happen again. She stood with her mouth closed, looking at the prince, not understanding why it had happened, and a share of shock, with fright as well as fear. At the same time, a warrior with good hearing who was standing guard at the top of the fortress, which at the moment was the third prince. The priestess and her guard asked his colleague if he had heard anything. Lily, who was in a 10-year-old body, awkwardly stepped back a little, thinking that it was all nonsense. And with fear and confusion on her young face, she wondered what it was all about. While her soft and pleasant-looking hair slightly covered her face, on which now was funny a lot of emotions from not understanding what happened to fear, and from not clear foresight and from the side of the prince. Before she got there, the third Prince Arrow Elliot, about whom not the most pleasant words were lied to her, seemed to her not only the main source of problems, but also the most uninterested in all things ordinary man, which he was, she thought, rethinking the whole situation. What flashed through Filia's mind after this whole nightmare was that she thought that with her powers she would be able to get into his mind. But the girl, who looked to be about 10 years old, looked with horror on her face at the third prince, tired and with a stream of sweat, not realizing what was happening. And the cold as ice and as if evaluating eyes of Arrow Elowit continued to look at her just as before, from top to bottom. And the owner of those two beastly eyes himself was sitting leaning on the magnificent throne and throwing one leg over the other, turning away with a cold sweat that protruded in fear, incomprehension, and shock, so as not to look him in the eye. It occurred to her that this was incredible. She had absolutely nothing going for her, and this was the first time such a thing had happened. And at the same time, the dark-haired third prince, Arrow Elliot, rather coldly and casually looking at the priestess who had just screamed, asked her what her name was, while the priestess from the No Filia monastery just stood there with a wild rain on her body and undisguised fear in her eyes that drove cold sweat away from Arrow. And her guard was clearly perplexed by this turn of events and only called out to her, not really knowing what to do. With a shiver in her head and body, she stammered and introduced herself, saying that her name was Filia and that she had just become Dong-hyun. After her, the guy standing next to her, called Diati, who was accompanying the priestess, introduced himself. The third prince with the monster nickname only grinned faintly, as if mocking the two who had come from no monastery and the whole situation. Lily, who was already scared out of her wits, was even more surprised to see Arrow's reaction and looked at it with incomprehension, wondering why he was laughing. The prince, meanwhile, did not hesitate to get up from his luxurious throne, even though he was not wearing the finest of robes. As he rose slowly but confidently and made his way towards the priestess, he looked quite composed. His long, all-black, obviously high-quality shoes with a rather small but present platform and with red bloodstains on them, were treading on the same color carpet as the young priestess. Looking quite tall himself compared to Lily's 10-year-old body, he came quite close to the girl who was shaking and did not dare to look even in the direction of the prince, who came closer and closer step by step. With his hands, on which he wore a bloody red glove, he roughly grabbed the face of a small, pretty girl and turned her head in his direction, at which she herself was very surprised. Deliberately bending over to be closer to the girl, who was now in a state of extreme shock, he asked with irritation in his head and on his face why the hell they had sent a child there. Lily herself was frightened and stunned by this sudden prank of the Prince of Spikes, so much so that she couldn't even do anything, neither say a word nor twitch. Though, even if she were in a normal state, she would hardly have acted sharply, considering who was standing in front of her. The prince himself looked at that frightened face with a certain amount of interest and otherwise indifference, as he did at many things around him. He looked with his dark blue eyes directly into Angel Rosa, as if studying this tiny girl whose abilities are astounding. The contrast of the frightened-to-hell servant of the convent No with blonde hair like millet or sunset, and quite calm look of the third prince, all appearance, and especially hair which was very cold color, as if the night sky after sunset. Hovering over the poor girl, he asked with an intimidating smile on his face why they had come here, to which he received an answer from a trembling Lily, who set about the declaration of war. Still in the same, not the most polite and nice pose, he looked down at the priestess of No and asked the frightened girl if that was what the high priest had ordered them to do. The one clutching tightly the hem of her brown-colored garment, trying to gather herself in a similar manner. In her head she thought that the high priest was the person who had asked to prevent this from happening, but now was not the time to think about that and needed to act sooner rather than later. Against the background of the chest that was under the water and next to which the key was located were Filia's thoughts that it was necessary to get into Arrow's soul, to find the key hidden in the abyss, and to lure him to her side with sweet talk. And now it was just the right time. But because of the fact that this had never happened to Lily before, and the fact that it was hard for her to breathe, could not open her eyes, and in general was in a deplorable state of only one meeting with the third prince. When the intimidating dark as the night prince loomed over the light priestess, the second in her mind arose a question, whether he was just a man. He himself was either soulless or astonished at the angel Rosa that was now standing in front of him. His bags under his eyes were clearly visible against the background of pale skin and bright blue eyes, which perfectly harmonized with his black as tar hair and style of clothing. The one who was so brazenly and rudely grabbed by the face did not even resist, but only trembled like an aspen leaf, covering her eyes and even so, looking cute. After a while, he lets Filia go with a smug look and words about how it was none of his business and how good it was that the priestess had come, for they were asking for her blessing. With a glance at his ward with the corner of his eye, he told him to order the commanders to perform the ritual at dawn in 4 days. When asked about the 4 days, he explained that he had to get permission from the little priestess with a nonchalant look. Even though Hima said with a smile on his face that he would do as the prince ordered, he thought in his mind that it was bad, because after the blessing the war would start, and as if mentally tried to convey that it should not be allowed. But when he looked at the little girl, who looked 10 years old, he was surprised and realized that it was not the best thing to do. After all, she was clutching her clothes with her fists so hard that she was shaking as if she were clutching at the last straw that would keep her alive. And she herself looked extremely unwell. The expression on her face and the shaking all over her body, the heavy breathing, the cold sweat all over her body was not a sign that she was doing well. Noticing this, the prince's aide, who was an inveterate principled man, was extremely concerned, whether it was because one of his few hopes of preventing the war of terror, or because such a girl was so frightened. While the prince continued his line, mentioning the event of what would happen in 4 days, being in front of Lily with her guard standing behind her. Prince Akansu's cloak was oversized and evolved, contrasting on the red carpet, being the dark gray cloth that so suited Arrow's image. And already with a more welcoming smile and pleasant expression on his face, he held out the glove that was covered in blood with the words that he was asking Filia Rose to bless them in this war. While Lily herself still looked scared, shocked, and yes, not at all okay, as she shouldn't have been. Immediately after meeting with the prince, Filia ran to her room as soon as she heard about the ritual. She obviously didn't want to have any more conversations about it right now. The girl was immediately followed by Mr. Himas. The man flew into the room with questions about what date suits the girl, and whether she will even conduct the ritual, but she did not listen to the assistant prince. She on the couch, face down, hoping that it will all end soon. Hima started to get a little angry at the priestess when he noticed that she didn't listen to him at all. After a while, the girl raised her head from the couch and looked at the official with an annoyed look. Hima shouted at Filia, hoping that she would say something, because he had been standing there for a couple of minutes, trying to draw out her plans for the ritual, which irritated the girl herself, who didn't understand what she wanted. In her head, the priestess had only lines from the prophecy, which said that the royal family of Elion, whose history was 400 years, from the moment of its foundation, will literally perish, because an invisible monster will appear. She remembered the prince's hand, which he extended to Filia at the beginning of their acquaintance. The hand in a black glove was very well remembered by the girl, because the first thing that caught her eye, as soon as the guy extended it, was fresh traces of blood. The girl as now remembered her reaction. She literally froze in place and did not take her eyes off the hand of her interlocutor. From shock, her pupils narrowed, and she was afraid to move. When Filia came out of this shock, she abruptly took her head to the side, letting out a small sigh, Drops of sweat appeared on her face from fear. The girl was clearly not ready for such a meeting. His Highness the Prince almost immediately realized that something had gone wrong after he held out his hand and saw the reaction of the guests. He immediately looked at his hand and realized what was wrong. The boy hurried to calm the priestess and assured her that she had nothing to fear, because the glove had only wolf's blood on it. Then the prince was brought a basin of water so that he could wash his hands and not scare his caller. His Highness took off his gloves and dipped his hands in the water. He confessed that he himself did not like to be in the blood, and that most likely Filia did not understand him correctly. Next, the guy stood with his back to Filia and began to shake off the excess water droplets from his hands. He turned his face slightly towards the priestess and said that he thought she thought of the wrong blood first. Then His Majesty the Prince quickly turned to the girl. He began to look at her seriously from top to bottom. It very much strained his assistant, Mr. Hemos, who was standing next to him, because he could not think what now can be expected from the crazy prince, and it also not a little frightened Filia herself. The prince gradually began to lower his newly washed palm on the head of the priestess. From fear she could not move or do any action. She did not understand what was happening now, and why the hand of her interlocutor is now confidently approaching her head. Abruptly, Filia felt something from which she became uncomfortable in an instant, namely His Majesty, put his hand directly on the top of the girl's head, and like a child, as if with a sneer, began to rub her head. Then the prince said that since the guest had come from far away, he would treat her with special care. Yes, the words expressed how much the prince respects his guests, but specifically from him, Filia found it scary and unpleasant to hear. The boy kept his palm on the girl's head. He hoped aloud that she would be comfortable here, and then continued to look at her with his mad blue eyes, while the priestess stood and prayed that it would all be over soon. The girl did not like the fact that the prince had first teased her, and now he was trying to express his concern with a sneer. It made Filia very angry, for how could a common man treat the angel Rosa like that? Her fury had no limit. She was determined that now more than ever she should gather all her will and pride into a fist, and look into the eyes of His Majesty the Prince once again. After the girl began to fill with her power and literally give off a blue aura, the prince immediately pulled his hand away. In his blue eyes now read not superiority, but the usual fear and surprise mixed with panic. Filia's eyes grew larger and larger. Now they resembled two blue portals with rifts in the middle, from which blue energy poured out like pure water. This was after the high priestess decided to remind herself that she was a thief and people were books on a shelf. His Majesty the Prince literally drowned in this blue stream. He stood with his mouth slightly ajar. Now he was afraid to touch the priestess even a little, because now he did not know what to expect from her. But then the prince gave out something that the girl certainly did not expect. When they were both in the flow of her blue energy, his unknown energy also awakened and began to apply black spots of energy of the priestess. Then Filia realized that even though people were books for her, whom she could safely read, now she had chosen the wrong book at all, and maybe the prince wasn't even a book if he was able to fight back the girl's energy. Filia remembered it all with some resentment at herself. She did not understand how immediately could not realize that the prince is not an ordinary man. He was something that the little priestess had not encountered before, and it even a little frightened her. A high cliff into the void, an endless cave, a gloomy darkness. That was the impression left by His Majesty the Prince after that incident. But then Filia had to get out of the flow of her thoughts, because Mr. Hemos began to shout even louder to attract her attention. It really pissed off the girl, and Diati, who was standing with the official, with his look as if to say that he was shocked at how Filia tolerated it all. And this time Hemos's shout worked, because it was as if he pulled Filia out of her reality. She came out of her thoughts and looked at the men sleepily. Now Mr. Hemos finally got her. Hemos started stomping his feet and expressing his displeasure about how he believed the high priest when he praised the angel Rosa, and how he expected a lot from her, and that he was not satisfied that the girl just gave up like that. But at the official's shouting, Filia only asked Didi to take her uncle out of the room because she didn't have the strength to bear it all. This made Hemos stunned. The sun was shining in the kingdom, with the castle's sharp towers towering over it. The magical fortress glistened under the rays of the morning sun, while inside, the first conversations about the ritual had already begun. Mr. Himas walked out of the room resentfully, his mind reeling from Filia's words and the way she called him, uncle, so childish, yet so demeaning. The two guards who saw the official leave the room worriedly asked if he was all right. At this time, the priestess was sitting in the room and hugging a pillow, looking furtively at the door where Himas had just come out. The girl held on with her last strength not to vent all her anger. One moment, and Filia exploded. Her rage was unstoppable. The girl was no longer clutching the pillow. From anger, she was ready to tear it to pieces, because the priestess could not believe that she had lost to such a monster as the prince. She couldn't understand what was wrong with him, or if he was even human. Filia was terrified that for the first time her abilities didn't work. This moment took away much of the girl's motivation to try, to defeat the prince again. The priestess was also angry that after all Himas dared to speak to her under her hand, and why the high priest had assigned her such a difficult task. The girl's emotions literally thought that the old man is a straight road to hell. Soon the girl cooled down. She realized that there were 4 days left before the ritual, and she understood that there was no time to make a fuss, but the desire to let go of her hands was stronger. Filia sat on her knees and bowed her head down, and next to her sat Didi, who tried to calm her partner by putting his hand on her back. Suddenly the girl asked Diadi what he thought about the prince and the situation around them. The guy hesitated a bit and answered that for him the case did not seem easy. For Filia, this assessment seemed too calm. She did not believe that this was all that a normal person could see in the situation. After a time, the priestess mysteriously turned her back on the knight. Filia, clutching the white sheet with her hands, expressed her resentment at not even being able to meet the prince's gaze. She had a strange feeling when she was near him. She didn't understand why this was so, and how his majesty was different from other people. The priestess sat closer to Diati and frowned at him with a resentful look, receiving in response only a nice and relaxed smile of the guy. It was as if he had hoped that everything would still be fine. From the lips of the girl suddenly sounded a serious question. It was not directly related to the situation, but all the same sounded very serious and strange. And the question was whether Diati had ever killed people. Because of this sudden question from the nice and calm smile of the guy was not left a trace, replaced by only a distraught look and a couple of drops of sweat on his face, he pretended that he did not hear the first time and gently asked the girl to repeat the sentence again. Filia realized that the question wasn't quite right and she clearly shouldn't have asked it. She looked at Didi with her big, guilty eyes and asked if she was even allowed to ask detailed questions. The knight's face changed again. He calmly looked somewhere in front of him and calmly assured the girl, who now couldn't take her eyes off him, that everything was fine and that it was about something else. Then he thought about the answer for a while. Didi shifted his gaze to the priestess and calmly explained that he had once dealt with murders, because in Libanos there was always a war going on. But then the girl decided to ask one more question, which again put the guy in a stupor, and that was how many murders he had on his record. The guy tried to keep eye contact with the girl and keep calm, but it was obvious that it was very difficult and awkward for him to answer such questions, although he thought about the new question, trying to formulate the most adequate answer. Filia realized that it was very difficult for Diati, and so she allowed him not to answer the question. The girl was visited by thoughts that the guy might be different from others because he was actually a murderer. But the problem was that these thoughts visited the priestess for no good reason. In Didi's eyes there was uncertainty and unwillingness to speak, something that made the girl think that the knight had actually killed not so few people in his life, but she could not rest, why his soul was so calm then. The priestess and the knight sat motionless on the bed in those luxurious chambers. There was an awkward silence between them, each afraid to move or say anything, though Filia still didn't miss a chance and did a little analysis of Didi's personality. She realized that Brother Diadi was quite different, and if he were a book, the content of it would be clear and accurate because the guy himself, though he had seen the war, but still managed to remain kind and simple, unlike the prince. But what about His Highness? In the blue, like a clear sky, crystal clear water, or frozen tears, the eyes of His Highness, the prince, read that the guy was clearly out of his mind, like a madman, anger, ruthlessness, indifference, and a strong desire to kill. He sat majestically on his throne with a sad look to nowhere, propping his head up and putting his foot on his leg. At first glance, the guy could not tell that he had already had dozens of murders on his account, and that he was overflowing with a thirst to commit new ones. These reflections quickly tired the priestess. Lately, she had not been able to rest and distract herself from the bustle that surrounded her, and this contributed to the fact that now she wanted to give up rather than continue to fight. Filia timidly turned to Diadi, who continued to sit next to her. She suggested that she could spend the last few days of her stay in this place and then just go home, forgetting everything that was going on here. There was an awkward silence between the companions. The Knight Diadi could expect anything from the priestess, but not this. He couldn't believe that the girl was so ready to give up. Didi decided to ask Filia if she was joking, hoping that she would answer that it was really a joke, and then they would continue to think what approach they could find to the prince. But, unfortunately, the girl calmly answered that she was not joking at all. Diadi decided to remind the priestess that the prince would not let them go just like that, and this reminder caused a storm of emotions in the girl. She burst into tears because she did not understand why the blessing to start the war was given to her. From despair, the girl lay on the side of her head directly on the floor. Her tears did not stop pouring. She did not like the fact that she literally had no choice, because she realized that if she did not do it, and the prince will not get away from her, and if she does, the war will begin. The girl looked at the guy with a pitiful face. Right now, she didn't want to do anything anymore. Not to make a choice, not to try to talk to the prince somehow else. Right now, she just wanted to get home. But most of all, Filia was angry with the high priest. She thought that giving her such a difficult task was too cruel from his side. And now the girl was ready to give up everything to go home and kill her mentor out of anger. And at the same time, Mr. Himas, who was very angry from the situation and from the behavior of the priestess, was sitting in his office and trying to think about the situation on his own. He slapped his palm on the desk with anger. The official did not want to realize that now almost everything is over and that the whole kingdom is lost, because if the situation that has developed at the moment do not intervene in any way, then in 4 days and really start a war. Yes, the high priest promised Mr. Himasu that Angler Rose would resolve the situation, but unfortunately she failed and certainly will not be able to stop the prince. The girl herself was lying in her chambers at this moment. She was so tired of everything that she decided that it would be best for her to go to bed now. Mr. Himas at this time sat pondering what to do next, and how to keep the kingdom safe from the prince's madness. The man fell to one knee, covering his face with the palm of his hand out of despair. Filia slept. In her dream she had another vision, where the sun was shining, everything was green, harmony and order reigned all around. Suddenly there was a voice that called out to His Highness the Prince. The voice was followed by a young man who looked very much like Mr. Himasa, so the priestess immediately realized that this message would be connected to him and the prince, and the girl also realized that now His Highness was called by him. The sky around changed its color to a more delicate pinkish, and from the bushes that were everywhere began to fall leaves. And it slowly began to drive the girl crazy, because in the dream she wanted to rest. But in the end, the situation with the prince caught up with her and there. From this, Filia woke up sharply and burst from the pillow. She began to remember where she could see the same bushes as in her charge, because they seemed very familiar to her. At this time, the girl's eyes again appeared in front of her eyes, where under the influence of the wind from the green bushes fall leaves, and then the wind begins to twirl them before gently put them on the ground. From such a sudden mirage, the girl was startled. She was very frightened, as she was not prepared to see that place again. At this time, Mr. Himas was still sitting in his office, thinking about how to resolve the situation and prevent the outbreak of war. Whether he would do it himself or with the help of guests, it didn't matter now. The man picked his head up with his hand. This was an extremely tense moment for him right now. At the same time, Filia was sitting on the bed in her luxurious chambers, covering her face with her hands and just screaming. The girl was screaming from exhaustion, from the fact that even in her sleep she couldn't escape from the situation. And it made her wonder even more whether she could give up everything now and just go home. Filia wanted to give up and run away. She didn't care anymore, and even when Diati intervened, saying that the fate of the country was being decided, she replied that if a child was entrusted with the fate of the country, then things were very bad. She didn't understand why the high priest had sent her there. Lying on her bed, she decided to go to sleep. As Filia thought, everything was already obvious. She thought there was nothing more she could do. Rubbing her hair, she tried to put her thoughts in order. Suddenly, the high priest's words about not caring if blood was shed in Akansar popped into her mind. Suddenly, her pupils went black, and she slipped into unconsciousness. Turning around, she saw the figure of the high priest looming over her. The superior appeared behind her and leaned over her and told her to do what she could. Filia's eyes bulged with shock, and she stood motionless. Filia turned around sharply. She was desperate. She couldn't understand what was happening. Filia repeated time and time again, looking at the faceless figures, that there was nothing she could do. It wasn't what she expected when she came here, but she didn't get any understanding from them. Suddenly, her dark side crept up to her ear and began to press even more, calling her excuse lame, asking if she was sure there was no other way out. The second Filia was hinting at something the real one couldn't understand. Suddenly, the real Filia started to counter, saying that it wasn't just an excuse, but the truth that her powers weren't working on the prince. The second Filia agreed with that, but she questioned if it was true that Filia couldn't do anything else. The dark side of Filia poked her in the chest and told her not to be so cocky and try to use the people around her, adding that her ability wasn't the only solution. Moving closer, she said that, after all, Filia was just a human too, and goosebumps ran through Filia's body. Trying to drown out the voice in her head, Filia covered her ears and mentally asked her to stop and leave her alone. Suddenly, the voice in her head subsided, and taking in what was being said, Filia began to slowly realize what she needed to do. She was reminded of a ball she had seen in a dream not too long ago, and because of her confusion, she had almost forgotten about it. Filia realized that the prince she had seen in her dream was the same Aro Elion. He was beautiful and bathed in love and happiness, and people looked at him with admiration. There was nothing intimidating about him. There was no desire to kill. Filia realized that the prince she'd seen was his opposite, his bright side. The prince that was now with Filia was a thorn-wounded beast that had grown pale, in dark hunting clothes, in the rough fur of a wolf, not as graceful as the one from her dream. The puzzle began to fit together in Filia's mind, and she remained in shock for a while longer. Having finally solved the riddle and now knowing how she would proceed, she smiled. She said to herself that the prince was an impossible task for her, that she didn't want to fight for him. All she needed was to escape from this place as fast as possible. Filia found herself in someone's memories. She was sitting on the grass leaning against a tree. The memories gave off a warmth, so Filia felt great. A sound in the tree caught her attention, and she lifted her head to see what was there. High up on a thick tree branch sat a boy with a bird in his arms. His reaction was cute. He only smiled warmly at his buddy. Suddenly the bird pecked the boy's finger. Suddenly someone else's tears rolled over Filia, but the sight of the boy mesmerized her as well. In her mind began to appear someone's words intended for the boy. This someone described the prince as an apple under the autumn sun, as a midday wave said that the boy smiles so beautifully, very beautifully, beautifully. She kept talking about him, confessed that she would do anything for him. For Filia, the owner of these feelings, was a mystery. Suddenly someone's cry calling for the prince distracted Filia. The prince showed his tongue and began to sarcasm, saying that he would not shout, that he almost fell out of the tree because of him. The other one didn't stop. Knowing that the prince was lying, he told him to come down immediately because he was late for his history class. This picture of the prince and Himas amused Filia. Suddenly an excited shout reached Himas. The prince pretended to fall. Himas rushed to catch him. Filia was equally shocked. Her arms stretched out hastily to catch the prince as he approached the target. With horror in his eyes and his mouth wide open, Himas ran headlong. Falling leaves ruffled hair. Holding the tree branch firmly with his feet, he hung upside down. Still showing his tongue to Himas, he made a disgruntled face. Mocking Himas, he began to say that he killed the prince by making him fall from the tree, while Himas's heart sank into his heels. As he continued to play, the prince told his bird Pier to fly and send a message to his mother and father about how Himas almost killed the prince, while Himas himself asked why he was acting like that and not wanting to learn. Filia watched everything carefully, the expression on the prince's face, his actions, everything. Answering to Himas's question, the prince said that he had brothers, and it was already decided who would take the throne and who would be his advisor, and it meant that the prince himself could have fun. Suddenly, Filia came out of her recollection. She jumped up from the bed and stared wide-eyed into the distance. The warmly smiling prince flashed before her eyes. Once again, someone else's feelings took over. The pain caught up with Filia again. Someone else's pain, covering her face with her hands, she cried bitterly. Filia asked herself why she was in so much pain today. A question wondering what business he had come to him with rang out in the silence of the office. Looking away, Diadi stood with his arms crossed behind him, not knowing what to say. Himas asked what business they had with him. It was obvious that he was not happy about the meeting. Diadi cautiously began the conversation by saying that the priestess wanted to talk to him, but Himas didn't want to go to her because he had been chased away earlier. But Diadi explained that there was no need to go anywhere. Stepping a little to the side, Diadi revealed that he had come with her. Diadi tried to unhook the girl, but it was futile. She clung to him. Himas began to resent her for kicking him out recently, but Filia didn't keep quiet either and muttered that it was his own fault. Himas was surprised. He wondered what had changed in the half hour that the girl had come to him. Suddenly, Filia looked out from behind Diet, and Himas saw her face red from tears. He was confused and began to ask why she was crying and what had happened to her. He almost accused Diadi of forcibly bringing the girl, but Diadi immediately shook his head, showing that it wasn't him. Suddenly, the girl turned to Himas, and he lowered his gaze to the girl. She told him that she wanted to tell him something, still holding Diada's pant leg. Filia was once again overwhelmed by Himas's feelings, and she was already at her limit. A heavy crying sounded in the room. Filia's tears were pouring down in streams, and no one could figure out what was wrong with her. Himas was perplexed as to why the girl was crying and what was even going on. The two grown men had nothing to do but just watch. Filia was able to say what she wanted to say. Despite her incessant tears, she said that she would try to stop the war. Through her tears, she tried to say something. Wiping the tears from her face, Filia asked for help to stop the war. Diadi put his hand on the girl's shoulder to comfort her. The library was well lit with comfortable couches, tables with stacks of books on their tops, and high, ceiling-high shelves of books along the walls. On one of the muted red sofas in the center of the room was carelessly thrown a luxurious dark blue cloak with light fur trim and black leather gloves. There was also a huge desk with stacks of scribbled sheets of paper and an inkwell with a quill stuck in it. A dark-haired boy was deftly tousling his glossy strands with long, graceful fingers. In a chair near the table was a handsome fellow with damp black hair and a towel wrapped around his neck. It was Prince Ero Elion, and this was where he usually did business. The gaze of his piercing blue eyes was staring straight ahead, and there was only one thought running through the young man's mind. 4 days from now. He was looking forward to this event with great anticipation. The image of the man he hated stood before his inner prince. A golden crown flaunted on his head, and his hair, which was the same shade as his own, was carelessly styled. This man was clad in a blood-red robe. Ero smiled with the thought that he would soon be able to get rid of this man completely. He would finally destroy him. The sickly anticipatory smile on the young prince's lips would have made anyone cower in a corner. Ero? Elion laughed loudly and merrily, leaning back in the gilded back of the luxurious chair he sat in. He pulled the towel off his neck, brushing black strands of hair away from his face. But suddenly he heard the shrill crying of a child very close to the library. What an annoying child that dared to cry loudly and disturb the peace of the future ruler. Prince Ero Elion jumped up from his chair in fury, trying to realize what kind of outrage he was hearing right now. It was indeed a child's crying, a sound he could not have expected to hear outside his chambers. There was a knock at the door, and the man behind it respectfully addressed the prince, informing him that a priestess from the Temple of Rose had come to see him. This very small clergywoman was sobbing right now near the entrance to the library. Ero Elion was a little relieved to learn that the child who had disturbed his peace was the little clergywoman. But he still wondered what could have happened in the half hour they hadn't seen each other, and what had caused the girl to become so hysterical. Burning with curiosity, he ordered the entrance of the weeping disciple of the high priest and her attendants. And before him stood the sobbing little girl, held by the hand of the young deity. Outside the library there was a sepulchral silence, the gilded stucco of the walls gleaming faintly against the whitewashed panels, as the next meeting between Filia and Prince Elion took place inside. The young man was astonished and indignant at the information his guests were telling him. It turned out that the reason why the little clergywoman was shedding tears was quite serious. The Holy Scripture was missing. The dark fellow rose from his throne and froze in amazement. On his face loomed incomprehension, surprise, and stupor. After the prince asked how this could have happened and where the writing could have gone, Diati admitted with undisguised concern that they had been attacked on the way to the palace. And it was probably in the turmoil which had been caused by the unexpected, insidious attack that the Holy Scripture had been lost. Filia wept again, occasionally wiping her tears with the sleeve of her cassock. Half an hour before the prince learned of the loss of such an important item, something else had happened in the darkened palace of Akensair, whose tall, graceful towers were lit only by moonlight. In one of the rooms of the palace, the little apprentice of the high priest was sobbing self-consciously, and through the sobs one could barely distinguish incoherent lines. Something about the war, which every day was getting closer and closer to their state, and in general was becoming almost inevitable. Still a little calmer, the girl announced to the man in front of her that she would try to stop the coming war, and for this she asked for the help of the knight, whom she met quite recently, because independently, little Filia will not be able to accomplish what she has planned. The man was confused. Not even an hour later, this self-confident little girl drove him away with a not very friendly look. But now Filia, in tears, was asking for his help, trying her best to stop the impending disaster. The man was not at all pleased with what was happening. The clergywoman understandably concluded that it was because the knight was thinking too badly of the prince, but his heart was aching. In her dream, Filia saw the knight's memories and saw the prince through his eyes. Before the girl's eyes, pictures from the vision she had received appeared one after another. A man's feelings when the one before whom you were in awe, whom you loved, for whose sake you would go even into the dangerous wasteland, suddenly changed and committed a terrible sin. The knight's whole world shook. Despair consumed him as if the sky had fallen to the ground. Angel Rosa was the last hope for the desperate knight, but after meeting the young apprentice of the high priest, he experienced a bitter disappointment. Her behavior did not inspire hope for a favorable outcome. Through sobs, Filia tried to apologize for her past behavior. Even after she apologized for her behavior, the man continued to mistrust her and asked how she was going to stop the war from starting. The young priestess replied that the necessary ceremony would require scripture. Filia told that yesterday, when they were on their way to the prince's palace, the wagon had been attacked and they had managed to survive on horseback. It was that unfortunate night that the scripture needed for the ceremony may have been lost. Filia also tells the knight that she's going to lie about the missing scripture. She would tell the prince that it had been left in a carriage on the road, so Elion would obligingly send men to search for it. The man was stunned at the idea of the high priest's little apprentice looking very innocent. He didn't understand how such a young girl could come up with such a cunning plan to prevent hostilities between the two nations. The knight tentatively suggested that he and Diati would then have to find this holy scripture and hide it in a secluded place. Filia, however, replied that there would be no need to do so. The young apprentice of the high priest suddenly took out from the folds of her cassock the scripture she was looking for, and held it out to the man in her small, childish hand, with the words that it should be burned so that no one would know about it. The knight recoiled in amazement at the scroll held out to him. Filia reminded him, with ostentatious regret, that it was a sacred scripture that belonged to the high priest himself. The young clergywoman again burst into tears, ostensibly regretting that this most precious thing, which had been handed down from generation to generation for centuries, would have to be burned for the good of all the people of their empire. A little later, standing in front of the prince of that very empire with tears in her eyes, she chuckled softly, remembering all that had happened and imagining the high priest's face when he learned of her sacrifices to prevent war. Elion looked at all the visitors with a scornful gaze, lingering on the little girl who had informed him of the loss of the scripture. His blue eyes were burning through her, but he was unable to return what he had lost with his gaze. Filia understood that, so she wasn't particularly frightened. However, she didn't like the way the prince glared at her, as if forgetting that she was an innocent child. The girl even had misgivings about Ero Elian guessing her involvement in the trouble. As expected, the young man jumped up from his chair, loudly and imperiously ordering the search party to gather and find the scripture. Filia thought that poor Diati should have been ashes by now, for the prince's gaze was fixed on him. And, no, she didn't feel sorry for the high priest and his scripture at all. Watching the disgruntled prince, Filia thought about the fact that the scripture needed for the ritual had been burned. Ero would now need to contact the church and get another copy, but the conservative church would not go along with him so easily. It could take several months to find a new copy, so Filia had bought herself the necessary time and expanded her field of action. However, there was one major disadvantage, and that was Ero Elion's displeasure, which might well turn on the young priestess. Filia even slightly sympathized with Prince Ero Elion, for she had made him worry in vain about the missing Holy Scripture. However, she was not going to apologize for her actions. The knight whom the little clergywoman had initiated into her plans paced nervously from corner to corner, agonizing over the idea and the propriety of his participation in bringing it to fruition. But though it was a dastardly plot against his suzerain, it was all for the greater good. The high priest's young apprentice stared straight at the young man who was called the beast in the prophecy, who had escaped into the thorny wasteland. She realized that there was no other way, and what was about to happen would happen anyway. Filia felt very small in comparison to the prince. The look in his blue eyes was mesmerizing and penetrating to the bone, but she was determined that she would pull the sharp thorns out of the heart of this beast. The next day was sunny and warm. The towers of the huge palace were bathed in the light of the piercing sunlight against the clear blue sky. The knight stood proudly erect, and with a serious expression on his face, he read out the report of yesterday's search party's foray to the scene of the carriage attack in an official tone. It turned out that nothing but wreckage was found at the scene. Filia asked with sadness in her voice about her belongings, but the man shook his head negatively and assumed that the refugees had dismantled whatever they could find. The girl exclaimed with feigned concern that her diary was among those things. The man looked at the high priest's young apprentice in utter confusion. Once again he saw before him the tear-filled eyes of a child about to burst into self-conscious sobs. The man had a cognitive dissonance. He saw before him a capricious child and hardly realized that this was the schemer who yesterday had come up with a cunning plan to prevent war. In the end, he decided to write it off as a coincidence. Felicia realized what he was thinking, but didn't let on. Yesterday, she had literally connected with this uncle's feelings and started working in accordance with them, but she wasn't going to be the savior and pull everything on herself. She would rather continue to act like a child and occasionally look into his soul. And then the young high priest's apprentice decided to consolidate her success in shifting responsibility onto someone else's shoulders and turned to the man capriciously, calling him a Josie once again. The young priestess cautiously inquired as to what His Highness was doing now. The man replied that Ero was awaiting his report on his search for the scripture. Filia inquired anxiously about the current disposition of the beast spirit. After hesitating a bit, the man replied that the situation was uncomfortable to say the least, and remarked that none other than them were to blame. The girl looked at the knight understandingly and somewhat sympathetically, but then, almost without transition, with a radiant smile on her lips, asked if she could look around the palace. And without waiting for an answer, the young apprentice of the high priest rushed to the exit accompanied by Diati. The bewildered man stayed where he was, wondering what the restless little schemer was up to this time. He gave the girl a suspicious look. Passing by the window, Filia looked at her reflection with interest. The two ponytails on the head of the high priest's young apprentice looked adorable, and the blue eyes sparkled like jewels. While the priestess was pensively looking at something in the window, Diati suddenly approached her, curious as to what the girl was seeing, and he leaned down to follow her. The lady's companion respectfully asked why she had been acting so strangely of late, and Filia, completely ignoring the young man's question, with a serious expression, asked if she wanted to wear ponytails or if her hair would look better loose. The young man looked fondly at the red-haired girl, whose hair glistened in the light like a bright sunshine, and smiling said that she was very pretty with any hairstyle. Filia turned her little head to young Diati, raised her huge blue eyes to him, and with childlike directness folded her fists in front of her breast. Then suddenly she galloped down the hall, reproaching the young man for not watching his words and admonishing him to filter his speech. The young man laughed merrily, and Filia complained that he was always mocking her. Diati ironically asked the young priestess what her hair had to do with where she was going. Filia gave the young man a scrutinizing glance and hummed thoughtfully. A pool of scarlet blood was spreading on the gray tiles of the floor in Ero Elion's chambers. The cruel prince's voice rumbled through the room as he grimly called his victim a nice man in the past. Grasping the bloody body of the young black-haired man by his shirt, he lifted him into the air. Holding his sword in his other hand, the mad prince admonished that maybe 1 time out of 10 he wouldn't have gotten mad, but this unreasonable one suddenly decided that Ero could leave it all like that. Leaving her hair in a 2-ponytail style, because it seems to suit her better still, Filia only becomes even more certain of her hunch that she's just plain cute, and therefore everyone definitely likes her, even Himasu. As Filia walks, the soldiers look at her. They turn around, happy to look at her, and happy that in such a dark place there is finally a cute girl like her, bringing God's blessing to their affairs. The seemingly evil soldiers smile happily at her, thinking that she is really just a beauty, so small, which means that she will grow up into a real written girl who will be courted by many guys and men. Some of the soldiers are more surprised not by her cuteness, but by the fact that she, at her age, is already wearing a priest's robe, while Filia thinks that all the soldiers are just terribly jealous of her youth, because she has already reached such a position at such a young age. Filia, plunging into memories, thinks that despite the fact that in this castle only soldiers, their views are much kinder than those that she received in the monastery of Rose, because the views of the high priestess as a and mentor, and said that she was sleepy, glutton, and so on. Abruptly remembering Rose, Filia stopped and turned to look at Diati, who continued to follow her with a calm and peaceful smile, just making sure she wasn't being touched to see what he thought of her. But a simple glance at Diati and his face would be enough without the priestess's ability to realize that even her escort himself thought she was just a cute kid in a priest's robe, which was already surprising enough. Giving herself a high five, Filia hopes that her charm can work on the prince as well, and then, if she can distract him for a while, she can try to read his soul again. Hoping that the prince should ideally be discouraged by the loss of the Holy Scripture now, the ability of the priestess herself should work better on him, since his worries were also affecting his inner world, which at least now should be shaken. Deciding that things should be taken more seriously from now on, Filia walks into the prince's reception room and sees bright red blood spreading across the floor, and this time definitely not animal blood, but human blood, the very real kind. The priestess, her attendant, and the soldados who guarded the prince's office were frozen in the doorway, for they were not prepared to see the bloody scene that was before their eyes. In the office, the prince pierced through with his sword one of his followers, which, as it seems, the priestess had not yet seen, which means that this man is hardly a soldier, although you could say so, given that he is not in armor, but in the usual form. The soldiers immediately tensed up and rushed to help, which was no longer needed, to the prince, who had managed to figure everything out on his own and did not need the help of anyone, while Filia, not taking away from the sight of the prince and the dead man, whom she was clearly not used to seeing, clutched at Diati's arm, believing that in case of anything, he would definitely be able to protect her. The prince's face seems completely impartial, as if he was not the one who killed the man now, not caring at all that anyone would see it, although, most likely, he understood the whole course of things, since he knew that he would not be punished for murder, because he is the head, and he decides what is good and what is bad. Before that, all the time holding the dead body on the blade of the sword and holding it with his hands, Arinu throws it on the floor, reporting that it is not an accident at all, and there is nothing so serious in all this, and there is no need to make any unnecessary noise. You cannot worry at all about the reasons for what happened. The prince, with his seemingly lifeless eyes, finally looked at those who were alive and not involved in his rebellion, who would also have come to his office to request an audience, which was no longer necessary. Given the situation, it was worth speaking directly. The prince, without any problems, is the first to start the dialogue, deciding to begin it directly with a question about the reason why the priestess forgot here with her attendants. And at such a moment, given that, according to rumors, the clerics have a premonition of the imminent death of a man. Guessing that the premonition of the man's imminent death might have caused Filia to come here to dismiss him with her prayers, the prince put forward his guess while Filia's thoughts were still lingering not on the dead man, but on the prince himself, on her task, on the fact that she must read his thoughts. Pushing the dead body with his foot, the prince said that the priestess should pray that the man should go quietly into the next world, or else, as the church says, the man's soul will not be able to rest and will wander the world forever. And Filia shuddered at his actions and was even more frightened. Being completely splattered with human blood, the prince looks at the dead man he himself killed, even with too much content and pity that ideally should have been on his face, and he calls the dead man his old friend. The man was still lying in his own blood and not moving, despite the fact that life had so abruptly swirled around him. He was already the epitome of some point of no return after the prince had stuck the blade of his sword into him. Filia looks on with undisguised horror, unable to take her eyes off the dead man, and if she were actually a 10-year-old child, what happened would have left a horrifying trauma on her that would haunt the child for years to come. Watching this, Lily remembered the priest's words about whether she wouldn't care when Akansar was covered in blood again, and just the mere notion made her blood freeze in her veins. She clenched her teeth and made it clear to herself exactly that she would not let the turmoil in Akansar begin again. The priestess took a couple of steps toward the prince and the dead body to ask why the prince had killed the man, as the high priest had said, but the man must have had his own motives and intentions. The prince replied that the dead man had asked to kill him, and he had simply fulfilled his wishes by condescending to him with his generosity and kindness, deciding that since the man was so willing, even the prince had no right to interfere with the fulfillment of his wish, but rather should help him. The prince grinned, taking his time to wipe the drops of someone else's blood from his face, hands, and clothes, and only watched the reaction of the young priestess, who, so far, was not going to answer him, but, unable to control his thoughts, he was still thinking about what had happened and about the man in whose body he had plunged his sword. Filia realized that this was her chance to finally get inside the prince's head and find out what he was hiding, at least a little bit. A little bit of information would be enough, at least to understand why the prince, who seemed even reasonable before, decided to suddenly kill one of his followers, even though he was preparing for war. Filia sees in the prince's mind how the murdered man, while he was still alive, tells something to him, so that the usually stiff and cold prince smiles and laughs, willingly talking with, in fact, a friend, obviously happy with such a calm conversation. She saw in the prince's mind how the murdered man had said something to him when he was still alive, so the usually stiff and cold prince was smiling and laughing and willingly talking to his friend, clearly feeling a bit displeased about it. A calm conversation. Suddenly, the would-be dead man pulls a blade, seemingly a small dagger, out of his jacket sleeve, trying to act quickly and without hesitation, looking at his victim with precision and cruelty, not at all regretting, apparently, what he had done. The prince, noticing the dagger being brought over him for a deadly blow, opened his eyes in surprise and froze in confusion, clearly not expecting such a despicable act from his friend and apparently loyal follower. But even though he trusted the man, the prince did not forget to be vigilant. The prince's eyes radiated not even disappointment, but the fact that he was terribly tired. The bruises under his eyes became even more obvious. But so far he still did not move, looking at the man he considered his friend, and the one turned out to be nothing more than a corrupt traitor of the enemy side. When Filia saw the whole picture, she was greatly surprised, and just like the prince some time ago, froze in complete confusion, because with such knowledge, the whole situation took a completely different view in turn, and revealed itself from a completely different angle. Filia's eyes filled with sincere regret for the prince, because now, seeing what had happened only 3 minutes ago, understanding that the prince had killed a man not just for fun, but from the point of view of self-defense, because the current dead man first attacked him. The prince's entire personality with such news seems to take on even more ivy and thorns, hiding his true reasons further and deeper, for what the priestess has seen now makes it clear that the prince is not a madman, but perhaps a defensive one. The prince orders the corpse to be removed as soon as possible, but he is interrupted by the priestess, who has the idea to ask the prince if he is all right, and perhaps if it were a normal life situation it would be clear, but not with a prince who has already killed several people. The prince, as well as all the soldiers, look at the priestess with surprise on his face and in his eyes, obviously not understanding what was the reason for this sudden question, which was probably true if you look at the objectively unstable psyche of the prince, at least if you judge by the rumors. The prince spreads his arms to the side, saying that he's fine, but Filia yells back at him, saying that the prince is not fine at all, that he needs help more than anyone else here, and that it would be strange to lead an army in such a state. The prince, clearly unaccustomed to such speeches and statements, replies that it is clearly not him that the priestess needs to worry about right now, which causes Filia's eyes to become almost hysterical. They fill with liquid, giving the impression that the girl is now crying. Tilting his head, the prince chuckles and his eyes go completely crazy again, and he after reminding the priestess of the lost scripture, saying that it is its disappearance that should worry her far more than whether or not he himself is doing well. Filia taps herself on the chest, saying that she wants to help the prince, and he says that to do so, she just needs to tell her when she finds the scripture, without which she can't do the ritual to start the war, to which Lily herself replies that she's talking about the wrong thing. Looking at the prince with eyes full of tears and despair, Filia continues her speech, moving on to talk about the prince's feelings, the reasons for his actions, and what is really troubling him, for now it is something that has been shaping the whole situation in the country and affecting it really strongly. Somewhere far away, where the bright sun still shines and the sky is not bound by dark clouds, the top of the monastery cross goes far away into the clear blue, not knowing what is happening to its main inhabitant, somewhere far away from the native temple. The high priest and the abbess of Filia are drinking tea, discussing the case on which the elder has sent the young priestess, and the woman, looking into her drink, says that after listening to all the details of the case, she worries about Filia more and more, as she has become very attached to her during all this time. She asks if it would have been better to tell Filia the details of the case, but the high priest says that there is no need for that, because she had to see everything with her own eyes and draw her own conclusions, and the girl's understanding is much better than both of them. The prioress exhales heavily and lowers her head and eyes, worrying for Filia, which is not unnoticed by the high priest, who says that the girl is not to be worried about, and notices that the woman talks to Lily in a childish way. Apparently not noticing this, the nun raises her head and looks at the high priest with surprise, asking if he thinks so, or if he said it to reassure her, and to find out what her, even parental, concern for the young priest expresses. The priest begins that the behavior of the mentor towards the pupil is clear, because the younger is terribly shy of others, but the nun should not be deceived, because she knows that Filia is special, and that she is not 10, but all 18 years old. As she sips her tea, the high priest says that Filia only looks like an innocent sheep, but in fact she is a real wolf, but not even her mentor noticed that after spending 8 years with her. He repeats that the girl is definitely not worth worrying about, because she, in addition to reading other people's souls, has another ability, and this peculiar reference the nun did not understand at all, asking for clarification. The high priest taps the Vaisik as if pointing to his own brains, or perhaps he meant his thoughts, the notion of which, in time, became associated with Filia. The high priest, making the nun reveal more of her apprentice's cards, says that Filia is effortlessly capable of clearly recognizing the thoughts of others. Meanwhile, at the castle in Akansar, the young priestess, who can clearly recognize other people's thoughts, is loudly and loudly not even crying, but roaring, hysterical, like a real 10-year-old child. She and Diari, who is leading her by the hand, are turned around by the passing soldiers, looking with horrified surprise at the cute crying girl who couldn't stop the release of emotions. As she continues to sob, Filia is also terribly angry at the prince, who because of her tears began to care and worry about her so harshly, treating her as if she were just a little girl, although it's not her fault, because it's not her who is crying, but her body of a 10-year-old child, which she can't fully control. She recalls a dialogue with the prince who, after the priestess offered to help him with his feelings, said that he didn't call her here as a psychologist at all, and Philith just had to keep convincing him that he was exhausted and distraught from the endless betrayals and murders. Lily continues, saying that no one can bear all this betrayal and torment alone, and that if this continues, who knows what will eventually become of both the prince and the state, and these words apparently made the prince so angry that he slammed his fist on the table with particular force. He angrily looked directly at the little child in front of him and asked if he should cut off her tongue so that she would shut up, saying it so threateningly and coldly that Filia turned white and trembled with fear in a moment. But surprisingly, she was still not going to give up, because now she had to try to get through to the prince while he was in such a difficult state and position. Fixing his hair and smiling, the prince says that the priestess needs to get back to her place soon because he's already at the limit of being nice and cautious with her, not even just because she's a temple attendant, but because she's just a little kid. Filia is angry and clinging to her hair, resenting both the prince, the situation, and herself for not doing a good job at all, even though she realizes that she shouldn't have gotten involved, just as she realizes that the prince wouldn't open his heart to her just by listening to her desire to help. Even if the prince wasn't going to open his heart to the priestess, in that fleeting moment when she was trying to find out the reason why the prince killed his old friend, Filia also managed to notice a field of thorns in the prince's heart where everything had dried up, showing as if there was nothing alive in the prince anymore. Filia can't cope with the tears rolling down her face because it's all just a child's body reacting to the signals her brain is sending, and since 10-year-old Lily has never seen such a nightmare before and has never empathized with anyone so much, the tears are pouring down on their own without stopping. She sniffles and roars, while Diadi asks her to calm down, twists around her, and tries to assure her that everything is all right, and indeed, now he is ready for a lot. Only if the young priestess would stop crying and so much upset about everything that is happening, because for the child, in his opinion, this situation was a strong blow. In hopes of calming the little priestess Lily, Diadi asks if she wants him to take her in his arms and carry her to their room, and to this Filia, turning to him, still in tears, nods a couple of times, because with all these tears and worries terribly tired, and from the nervous prince too. Climbing on Diadi's back, Filia thinks that the prince should be the same as her companion, good, kind, and ready to ride her on his back, as long as she does not cry, because she is just like a 10-year-old girl, even if she sometimes does not behave the same way. Diadi with Filia on her back calmly, in silence, reached their bedroom, and so that the girl even completely calmed down, no longer sobbing, and only by the red tear marks it was clear that the little priestess was crying, but they with surprised faces stopped at the door of their bedroom. They saw that their things in the bedroom had been overturned, the furniture was arranged as it was, and the soldiers were searching every wall, pillowcase, mattress, curtains, the whole room just up and down, evidently examining something, looking for something, but what it was, none of the representatives of the church could understand. While the little priestess watches their things being scattered, something being rearranged, furniture being put upside down, Diadi decides to ask one of the soldiers directly what they are doing, what and who has already ordered them around. The soldiers reply that the prince has ordered the entire room of their waiting guests to be searched for scripture, clearly suspecting the messengers of the church of lying and underhandedness, for they have full reasons to delay the ritual out of reluctance for war. The prince, not even looking at all the noise that he had managed to raise in such a short time, changed into clothes clean of blood, looking at the sun, which for the first time in a long time looked out through the dark clouds and now warmed with its light the whole castle, which had long ago become too cold. The prince fixes his shirt and looks out of the window at the sun, tiredly, because even though he hasn't seen it for a long time, it brings no joy at all. Because against the background of all the other terrible things, he wants sometimes, only more not to see this bright sunlight too bright for the dark prince beast. Filia says that from now on, M will have to be very careful, since the prince suspects them so strongly and not taking their words as something serious, they may have to not cross paths with him at all, and that went against all plans. The little priestess picks up a pillow, realizing that it would be up to them to clean up after the soldiers who had left their room a mess. Since they had not called servants or anyone else like them, they would have to do it themselves. Filia puts the pillow back in its place, looking around for the others, but in the end, the one she takes in her hands does not go anywhere, but just concentrates on it and clutches the pillow tightly. The priestess is already just floating with irritation and anger, so that the veins on the back of the children's palms are protruding, and Lily herself rocks, repeating in her head how much this mad prince, who dared to doubt her, pisses her off. After a while, Himas, who had already heard that the prince had ordered a search of the room of the priestess and her bodyguard, came to them and thought he would enter and find them broken. But what he saw simply confused him. Diadi was on all fours, all glowing, and when asked by Himas what was even going on here, he replies that he only did that because the priestess was sad and angry, and he only did that to calm her down. The sun outside the window continues to shine and delight the people of all of Akansara, who have come to miss such a beautiful yellow sky, which, since the priestess's recent arrival, has been shining almost constantly. Himas declares that the scripture plan was a terrible plan from the start, and now, given the prince's heightened suspicion, the whole thing is taking a turn for the worse. The priestess throws her head back on the back of the sofa from which she is already hanging, thinking about the fact that the mutually unloved uncle had come whining to her, and now all that was left was to figure out for what sins the Lord had sent her such a trial in his person. She sat down more or less normally, but still half turned towards the prince's aid, thinking that she should have just hit him, so that he too would stop doubting her and just start acting according to the plan, his with the high priest and his with her, because that way she could think. But when Filia looked at Himis, even without her ability, it was more than clear to her that the older man was more concerned about their rules than she was, even if their reasons were completely different from each other, overlapping only here in Akansar. After looking at Himis's pitiful face, the 10-year-old priestess's body realized that she wanted to cry again at such a touching scene, and the girl, in turn, actually cried, in her thoughts apologizing for her infirmity. After calming down a bit, Filia finally gets the idea that she should ask this Himas in order to understand the situation more and understand the prince more, because judging from Himas's own memories, she and the prince have been together since childhood. Filia asks if the prince is often so angry, to which Himas replies that the prince, on the contrary, is always calm, keeping the royal camp and all that. But even from this, the priestess had questions, only concerning his attitude towards her already. Himas remarks that the prince's reaction might be very justified, because the relationship between the church and the imperial family has always been not so great, and the priestess, remembering that as well, also thought about it. In their world, the church has the right to protect the imperial family, and that is why the two of them have such a rival relationship for power, for the position and adoration of the common people. The priestess draws parallels between the fact that the current emperor hates the priest and the prince hates her, even though she tried to be a calm person, but since she failed, she needs help. Finally, Filia asked what happened to the prince before they all came to Akanchar, daring to assume that before the massacre of his brothers, he himself also had something happen, and what it was, they have to understand and analyze. Himas lowered his head at that question, not looking so important anymore, and the frown, the compressed lips, and the fact that he was really worried, immersed in his memories of that very day, added to his terribly depressed look. Himas says that even he doesn't know exactly what happened to the prince, and this greatly surprises both Diati and the little priestess, who were already willing to listen to the story of the prince's becoming from everyone's favorite to the one who should destroy the country. Himaya adds that she has no idea what happened then, the day the prince killed his brothers, for then it all happened quite suddenly, without any suggestion or hint of such an action on the part of the prince. On the day when His Majesty the Emperor invited all three princes to the imperial dinner, the third prince was not yet living in Akansara, but in one of the emperor's palaces, with only one garden with a fountain and a variety of wildlife bustling about in its own way. The news that a princess from an enemy country, from Andros, would become the third empress and another wife of the current emperor broke with a clamor even among the common people who went on and on about it, saying that the emperor might have gone mad. All the people were amazed that the emperor had decided to make the princess of an enemy country his wife, talking about it both day and night, passing it on by word of mouth, so much so that the same interest was piqued among the distant aristocrats who seemed to have no understanding of the politics of the capital at all. The sleeping Himas was raised late in the night by his servants, and he, quickly pulling on his robe, was already downstairs trying to find out the cause of such a commotion, when the butler replied that a messenger from the palace had arrived with some very important news. Hima's face contorted into a horrified grimace as he was told that the crown prince and second prince had been killed while dining with the emperor, who had organized it to meet all of his offspring, but apparently something had gone wrong. Not eager to hear anything more and filled with excitement, Himas immediately jumped up on his horse and hurried towards the palace, even though it was still deep night, and if the princes were killed, he would unfortunately not be allowed in either. The only hope for Himas was that perhaps he would be met by the third prince, who he feared for more than anyone else, because he was a very close person to Himas, and to lose him would be a great loss. As the emperor gathered with all his children, the whole palace should be guarded by the most important people of the empire. Himas did not even get off, but jumped off his horse, not wanting to waste time on any trifles, and immediately moving towards the gate leading to the palace itself, and looked, aristocrat very confident, looking exactly in front of him. But at the entrance of the gate he was stopped by the soldiers, ordering and blocking his movements with their axes, making it clear that the entrance to the palace was strictly forbidden. With such circumstances, well, it was not much of a surprise. The Salatas informed Himak that the traitor prince Lao Ilion killed his brothers at a dinner, and before anyone is allowed into the palace, the guards and other law enforcement agencies must look into it and see if Himak, a close friend of the third prince, had anything to do with it. Himak's blood boils and he starts screaming that the soldiers are wrong, and they are all wrong, because Prince Leo couldn't have done such a thing, because he, though mischievous since childhood, was still just the sweetest person, a favorite of the society. Himas continues to shout as if hoping that the third prince will hear him and come out to meet him, but he does not, and the soldiers still hold their axes firmly in front of him, while the nobleman shouts where the third prince is and asks to see him. Himas is informed that the third traitor prince has escaped, and when he hears this, he immediately stops shouting, and, being completely confused, he stares silently at the man who told him about it without cooking. The chief and experienced knight, with a sad grin approaching Himasu, told him that one could not even hope or dream of meeting the prince in the very near future, for he had killed his brothers and immediately fled to his palace past the crowd of guards. At such a late night, the soldiers were immediately sent in pursuit, but even so, it seems that it is too late, and they will most likely not be able to catch up and capture that third prince to make him answer according to the law. Diadi and Filia, who had apparently been expecting to hear a very different story from the one offered, one that didn't match how it had all appeared to the people, looked at Himas with different eyes, with the bodyguard seeming to be far less surprised than his young charge. Himas bowed his head, hiding his worried look, realizing, ready already for any questions from the little priestess, for she would start asking them right away, beginning by asking for the reason, just because she didn't know. To the surprise of both Himas and Diadi, Filia, herself completely confused, asks if there are any guards in the palace at all, since the third prince managed to escape so easily that he was not caught immediately after the murder, or at least when leaving the palace. Himas tries to turn what Filia said into a joke, coughing and saying that the palace has a lot of experienced and excellent guards, warriors, even a lot of them, because the security of the ruling family is important for the balance of the whole state, which depends on this family. But since the third prince was able to get away from these soldiers, it is possible to doubt their competence. Filia thought for a moment, surprised that her theory that the prince had killed his brothers outside the city on the hunting grounds where the three of them would have been alone fell away. But even more, she didn't believe that the prince had easily evaded his pursuers and made it here. At the end, Himas added that he couldn't tell more because he didn't know any more, and all the information he had said had already been confirmed by the emperor. That is, nothing new and secret was known to the chief crony of the third prince, And when Fioya asked what the third prince was saying to his father, his crony had to think about it again. But as it turned out, the prince had never answered, said anything, explained himself, apologized, or tried to hide, evade, or excuse himself from the murders of his brother princes, but had instead passed a decree of non-disclosure of his own involvement in the murders that evening when he had escaped from the family dinner, effectively confirming his participation in the incident. Filia had hoped that what Hymas, the closest to the prince, could tell her would make her feel better, that a new plan would appear in her head and her problems would be lessened. But when she told him, everything became much more complicated. But it seemed that the older man was not lying because he was sincerely helping them, even if for the reason that he was trying to help the prince himself. Dayati spoke up, raising his hand to draw attention to himself, for he seemed to have some thoughts on what had happened or the reasons for it, since he had found something to share at a time like this. Dayati, being constantly among the most common warriors and simply people from villages and towns, remembers that lately he often hears that there are various rumors among the people about the reason why the prince is plotting a coup d'etat, but to say specifically about the one that would involve the new third empress of the country. From such a statement, Himas begins to scream and seems even hysterical, saying that it is all lies and slander, and that the prince did not like the new stepmother at all, that such a thing could not have happened at all, no matter what the empress herself did. Finally, it comes to Filia that when the people became aware of the prince's treason, they, in their already quite old custom, began to make up various tales and theories, based only on who knew what and what they really wanted to believe. One of the most popular versions, of course, is the fact that the third in line to the throne, the prince dreamed of seizing the crown and ruling the state. And this theory, in fact, vov set off the greatest demand among not only peasants, but also aristocrats. But immediately after the versions that the prince went mad, or that he was cursed by some unknown, perhaps from an enemy country, offended by the entire imperial family, a witch who wanted to take revenge through one on the whole family. In the last place of the accepted and most popular theories was that the third prince fell in love with a very young empress that is a princess of an enemy country, but was able to get the attention of both the father emperor and the third prince. But just hearing about this version, Hymas apparently got hysterical and still continued to yell that this is complete nonsense, because the empress was close to the second prince much more, and not with the third prince, and from the point of view of patriots, this version is the most unlikely. Hyas grinned and was ready to fight just to prevent the prince from having an affair with his new stepmother, whom he had spoken to perhaps twice in total in his entire life, and Filia sighed sadly, realizing that he knew nothing useful. Abruptly feeling a huge weight on her shoulders, the priestess thinks about the fact that she will probably have to take off the necklace, because otherwise she does not know how else to look for ways out of this whole situation and where to go in their case and investigation further because they have reached an impasse. Already anticipating how he will have to hide without the necklace, Filia asked why there is not a single girl in the castle, to which Himas replied that girls are simply forbidden to come here, and this obviously struck both Dayati and Filia, but she dared to ask the reason. In response, Himas says nothing sensible, except that the rule was put in place to prevent more murders, and Filia, frowning again, says that these are two completely unrelated facts. Himas recalls how in the past, the castle was often infiltrated by sent assassins who, surprisingly, every single one of them were girls, perhaps simply because they thought that this way they would have unhindered access directly to the prince personally, but he would be declassified and led away. And after realizing that girls were treated as potential enemies and assassins in this castle, and realizing the reason why the soldiers and Himas himself had reacted so surprised to her on their first meeting, she realized that things were going to be many times more difficult than anticipated. Leaving a small ray of hope, the little liaison asked if, after the girls were banned from entering the palace, the attempt on the prince and all the followers was accurate. And she received an affirmative answer, because there were no more attempts to penetrate from the outside. Now Filia doubted whether she would ever be able to remove the necklace in the place the high priest had sent her to, sighing heavily, and having already lost all hope of dealing with the lunatic prince. Asking if the emperor had sent the assassins, Lily gets nothing but that no one knows, except that whoever was behind the mercenaries had great wealth, since they agreed to go to such a place of danger. Filia doesn't even ask, but rather clarifies whether it's true that the prince can't sleep well, which scares Hamas again and makes him frown, having already imagined that the priestess is watching the prince at night. But he adds that everything can be understood just by looking at the circles under his eyes, and there's no need to be a scientist. Lily makes the most adorable, angelic face she can, so that Hamas will definitely not suspect or misunderstand anything about her, asking if he has a needle and thread, or where such things are kept in a castle full of men. On the table, an open box with various threads, needles, buttons, hardware. Here was everything one could possibly need for needlework. The little priestess and Dayati were sitting next to each other. They were discussing the details of the design of their common work, but in the end, they came to a consensus. Filia was carefully watching every needle in the young man's hands, now and then inserting her own remarks and dispensing what seemed to her to be valuable instructions. But Dayati only chuckled as he continued his work. Neither of them had ever done anything like this before, and so at last the work was finished. The result of their combined efforts was dubious: a pillow tied in the center with a red ribbon, with awkwardly stitched eye buttons and crooked mouth and nose seams. The craft remotely resembled a cat. Not a bit embarrassed and smiling happily, Filia announced that their work was simply awful, and Dayati, rubbing his hands together, said he wasn't going to deny it. However, the girl said that, in her opinion, it was not so bad. After all, anyone can see that a lot of time was spent on the creation of this masterpiece. Filia said it was time to request an audience to present the insomniac prince with a doll personally made by Lily, the priestess. Dayati marveled at the girl's plans, for Saint Lily must not lie, and Filia, with feigned regret, reminded that she was too young to be able to sew well, but the main thing is good intentions. Then the girl resolutely declared that from now on the pretty doll would be called Didi. She headed for the exit of the room, urging Dayati on. He had no choice but to doomfully follow the young clergywoman. On the way, the girl reminded him with a sweet smile that she just wanted the prince to sleep well while cuddling the soft Didi, who in turn was lovingly crafted by Didi's brother. After these words, the young man was a little embarrassed. However, he did not resist. The guards loomed menacingly near Aro Elion's chambers, but even the guards' calmness cracked when they learned that this ridiculous doll was intended for His Highness. Both were not particularly supportive of Filia's idea, but they did not let it go to their heads. The young high priest's apprentice entered the prince's chambers with determination and proudly placed the wadded-up freak on the table in front of Prince Aro Elion. With a sudden movement, a piece of absorbent cotton came out of the seam near the toy cat's ear. Aro looked at the strange product that the girl had brought with an amazed and contemptuous gaze. The cotton cat looked even more pitiful against the prince's black-haired, blue-eyed, handsome face. The prince looked at the toy freak with disgust and asked what it was. To this Filia, bowing slightly, replied with perfect calmness that she had made it as an apology. Aro interrogated interestedly what kind of apology we were talking about. With the same unwavering calmness, the girl reminded him that His Highness had gotten angry with her not long ago. The prince did not react to this statement, continuing to look at the girl as if waiting for her to continue.